The moment Gavin Mercer slid that paper across the table, he was smiling. Not a nervous smile. Not an apologetic one. A satisfied one. 12 years. Marissa Holloway had given that company 12 years of her life, and the man who benefited from every single one of those years sat across from her with a smile on his face while people outside that glass wall watched. And one of them, one of her own colleagues, laughed out loud. She heard it. If that had been you, sitting in that chair, what would you have done? Before we go any further, if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button right now and drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. Because what happened next? Nobody saw it coming. The rain started sometime around 6 that morning, the kind of slow, gray Atlanta rain that doesn't announce itself dramatically, but just settles in like it owns the place. Marissa Holloway noticed it when she pulled into the parking garage at Aldercrest Health Systems. Noticed the way the water pooled near the third-level drain that facilities had been promising to fix for 2 years. She made a mental note to send another email about it. That was the kind of thing she did. Small things. Invisible things. The things that kept everything from quietly falling apart while everyone else was busy looking at bigger pictures. She had dressed carefully that morning. The charcoal blazer. The silver earrings her mother had given her for her 40th birthday. She didn't know why she'd reached for them specifically. She told herself it was just a Monday. She believed that right up until she stepped off the elevator on the 14th floor and saw Gavin Mercer's assistant, Deb, look up from her desk with an expression that didn't quite know where to land. "He's ready for you," Deb said. "I didn't have a meeting with Gavin this morning. He asked me to send you in when you arrived." Marissa stood there for just a moment. Not long. Just long enough to register the particular quality of the silence around her. The way two people across the operations floor suddenly found reasons to look at their screens. The way Marcus from IT, who usually called out her name whenever she passed his desk, didn't look up at all. She went in. The conference room was the glass one, the one they used for client presentations, the one with the long table that always reflected the overhead lights in a way that made everyone look vaguely uncomfortable. Gavin was already seated at the head of it. Standing slightly behind him, and to his left, was a woman Marissa had met twice before. Diane Cho, from Human Resources. Diane was holding a manila folder and staring at a point somewhere above Marissa's left shoulder. That's when Marissa knew. She knew before she sat down. She knew before Gavin cleared his throat and said the words organizational restructuring and strategic realignment in the tone of a man who had practiced them in front of a mirror. She knew when she pulled out the chair across from him, and the legs scraped against the floor, and nobody flinched because the room was already braced. The termination letter was inside the folder. Diane slid across the table. Gavin slid it, actually. He reached over and took it from Diane's hands and moved it toward Marissa himself, and she thought later that this was the part she remembered most vividly, not the words on the paper, but the way his hand pushed it across the polished surface, almost casual, the way you'd slide someone a menu. She didn't reach for it immediately. "Effective when?" she asked. "End of business today." She looked at the letter then. Her name at the top, the date, the language about position elimination and severance terms, and the return of company property. 12 years distilled into 4 paragraphs. Through the glass wall behind Gavin's head, she could see the operations floor. She could see people trying very hard not to look at the conference room and failing at it. She saw the cluster near the printer station, Jordan, and Tanya, and she thought she saw the back of Derek's head. And she saw, unmistakably, Sienna Cross, standing near the door to the break room, with a coffee mug in her hand, and her eyes fixed directly on the glass conference room. When Sienna saw Marissa looking at her, she turned away. And Marissa would carry this moment. For a long time she heard it. A laugh. Short, involuntary sounding. The way a laugh sometimes escapes before the person can decide whether to allow it. But there. Real. Coming from somewhere in that cluster by the printer. Gavin didn't hear it or pretended not to. Marissa heard it. She set the letter down. Carefully. The way you set something fragile down when you want to make clear you aren't rushing. She aligned the edges with the corner of the folder. She took one quiet breath. "You understand this isn't personal," Gavin said. She looked at him. Not through him, not past him. directly at him, the way she almost never allowed herself to look at Gavin Mercer in 12 years of working for him, because she had learned early that direct eye contact with Gavin was something he categorized as aggression. She let him sit in it for 2 full seconds. People usually say that when they know it is. Then she stood up. She didn't slam her chair. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't ask for reasons she already understood, or demand a review process she knew wouldn't change anything. She picked up the folder with the termination letter, put it inside her handbag with the same deliberate care she'd used placing it down, and buttoned one button on her blazer. Gavin opened his mouth. She had already turned toward the door. The walk across the operations floor to her desk took 47 seconds. She had never counted steps in that room before, but she counted them that day, not intentionally, just because her mind needed something to hold on to. 47 seconds of absolute silence, broken only by the sound of her own shoes and the low mechanical hum of the ventilation system and the distant chime of an elevator somewhere down the hall. Nobody said anything. One person looked at her, Marcus from IT. He met her eyes for just a moment, and something passed across his face that was close to but not quite more, like the specific discomfort of a person watching something happen that they know is wrong, but have already decided not to intervene in. She pulled out the cardboard box from under her desk. She didn't know why she had the box. She'd had it under there for 6 months, brought in from the back of her car after a Costco run, kept meaning to break it down and recycle it. She was glad she hadn't. She put in the framed photograph of her daughter, Kira, at 10 years old, standing knee-deep in the ocean at Tybee Island, squinting into the sun. She put in the coffee mug with the chipped handle that said World's Oakiest Accountant that Kira had bought from a drugstore clearance shelf when she was 12 and thought this was the funniest thing she had ever encountered. She put in the small cactus on her monitor stand that she'd kept alive for 4 years through a combination of neglect and luck. And she put in the journal. The journal was the thing she couldn't leave. A worn, dark blue spiral notebook that looked like nothing special. She'd started keeping it in her 3rd year at Aldercrest when she'd lost 2 days to a routing error nobody could explain and nobody had documented. She started writing down what she found. Not formal documentation, they had a system for that, and it was useless, full of outdated procedures that bore almost no resemblance to what actually happened on any given day. This was her record. Handwritten, specific, ugly with abbreviations only she fully understood. Client names she'd shortened to 2 letters, vendor quirks, and the names of the specific people at each company who actually picked up the phone. The 3-step sequence that reset the insurance routing engine without triggering the error flag. The particular combination of claim codes that would freeze the entire processing queue if entered in the wrong order, and the fix for it. That wasn't in any manual because Marissa had found it herself at 11:30 on a Wednesday night, 3 years ago, and written it down before she forgot. She put the notebook in the box. She picked up the box. She walked to the elevator. She pressed the lobby button. The doors were closing when she heard it again, not a laugh this time, but voices, the specific murmur of people talking in the way people talk when they think the subject of the conversation is no longer present to hear them. She couldn't make out words. She didn't need to. The elevator went down. She sat in her car in the parking garage for 11 minutes. She didn't cry. She wasn't ready to cry yet. That would come later. At home, at the kitchen table, after Kira had gone to bed and the apartment was quiet, and Marissa had opened the stack of envelopes she'd been moving to the side of the counter for a week. The electric bill, the credit card statement, Kira's school fees, the small red bordered notice from the insurance company about a change in her premium. But in the parking garage, she didn't cry. She held the steering wheel with both hands and stared at the concrete pillar in front of her, and thought about 12 years. She thought about the weekend. She had worked 48 consecutive hours when the Meridian Hospital account nearly collapsed because of a software migration. She thought about Thanksgiving when she had left her mother's house early to handle an emergency billing failure. She thought about all the times she had been the one to pick up the phone when no one else knew what to do, the one to write the workaround, the one to sit with a paying vendor rep at 9 in the evening, talking them through a patch, the one who kept everything from falling apart so quietly and so consistently that somewhere along the way, everyone had stopped noticing that anything was being held together at all. She thought about what Gavin had said to her 6 months ago. He'd called her into a one-on-one meeting and talked in very general terms about the direction the company was moving. Younger talent, fresh perspectives, digital native thinkers. She had listened and understood exactly what he was saying and exactly what he was not saying. And she had gone home and lain awake for 2 hours and then decided she was probably misreading him because she had 12 years in that company and 12 years of results and 12 years of being the persons they called when everything went wrong. And surely that counted for something. Surely that was worth something. It was worth a cardboard box and 47 seconds of silence. She started the car. The apartment felt different when she got home. Same walls, same furniture, same stack of school forms on the counter that Kira had left before catching the bus that morning. But the particular quiet of an empty weekday apartment felt different when you were in it at 10 in the morning, without any particular reason to leave. Marissa put the cardboard box on the kitchen table. She took out the journal and set it beside the stack of bills. She put the coffee mug in the cabinet. She stood in her kitchen for a long moment. Then she called her mother. Gladys Holloway picked up on the second ring, which meant she wasn't in the garden, and she had her glasses on and was probably reading something at the kitchen table at her house in Decatur. It said hello, and this is a specific way she said hello when she already sensed something. I got let go today, Mama. Silence. Not the silence of shock. Her mother wasn't someone who reacted to bad news with visible shock, but the silence of a woman who is carefully choosing what to say first. Did they give you a reason? The reason they give in these situations. Which means no real reason. Which means no real reason. Another pause. And then her mother said, "Come eat." Marissa almost laughed. "I'm okay." "You're not okay. Nobody is okay the day this happens. Come eat." She didn't go that day. She told herself it was because Kira would be home at 4 and she didn't want to be across town. But the real reason was that she wasn't ready to be looked at with her mother's particular kind of love, which was warm and genuine, and accompanied by an expression that had the power to undo whatever composure Marissa was holding together with sheer determination. She sat at the kitchen table instead. She opened the stack of bills. She did the math twice, and then a third time, hoping the numbers would change. They didn't. With severance, she had approximately 4 months before the situation became genuinely critical. 4 months was something. 4 months was not comfortable. That night, after Kira had gone quiet in her room and the apartment had settled into its nighttime sounds, Marissa sat with her laptop open and the journal beside her, and she started writing. Not a letter. Not anything therapeutic. She opened her resume file, a document she had not updated in 8 years. Because why would she? She had 12 years of seniority at Aldercrest and fully intended to retire there, and she started reading it like a stranger, reading it for the first time. It was bad. The formatting was dated. Half the accomplishments listed were vague to the point of uselessness. Operations specialist with extensive experience in healthcare billing systems. What did that mean? It meant nothing. It was the language of someone who had spent so long inside one organization that they had forgotten how to translate what they did for the outside world. She started rewriting, not describing her job title, describing what she actually did, the system failures she had prevented, the client accounts she had retained through crises that no one else had been able to resolve, the specific dollar figures she could attach to outcomes. She pulled up old emails from her personal account. She'd had a habit, which Gavin had mildly discouraged, of ceasing her personal to address on important threads, which suddenly felt less like a bad habit and more like a form of insurance, and she used them to reconstruct a record of her own competence that Aldercrest had never thought to formally document. She worked past 2 in the morning. When she finally closed the laptop, she didn't feel better exactly, but she felt something, which was an improvement. Over the 11 minutes in the parking garage, she went to the bathroom, brushed her teeth, looked at herself in the mirror for a moment. "Okay," she said to no one, just that. Just one word. She slept. The next day she woke up at 6:30 out of habit and lay there for a moment before she remembered there was nowhere she needed to be. She lay there for 40 seconds. Then she got up anyway. She sent 3 emails that morning. One to a former client contact at a regional hospital system she'd helped through a billing transition 2 years earlier. One to a vendor rep she'd worked with closely enough that they'd exchanged direct cell phone numbers. and one to a woman named Delphine Carroll, who had left Aldercrest 5 years ago to start an independent healthcare consulting practice, and had told Marissa over lunch once that she should do the same thing, and had received a polite and dismissive response from Marissa, who could not imagine leaving a company she had spent a decade building something inside of. She didn't wait long for answers. The former client contact, his name was Robert, and he ran procurement decisions for a 4-hospital network in the Southeast, called her back within 90 minutes. He didn't express sympathy in the hollow way people do. He said, "I heard you'd left Aldercrest. When can we meet?" Marissa gripped the phone a little tighter. "When do you need?" The vendor rep, a man named Carlos, who she had spent the better part of 1 December troubleshooting a claims processing issue with, texted her before noon. 3 words, "Call me today." Delphine Carroll replied to the email within 4 hours, with a message that was 2 sentences long and remarkable in its directness. "I have been waiting for you to become available. Let's talk tomorrow." Marissa read that email 3 times. She put her phone face down on the table. She put both hands flat on the surface. She stared at the grain of the wood. Delphine Carroll had been waiting for her to become available. A woman who ran her own operation, who had clients across 3 states, who chose her partnerships deliberately and expensively. This woman had been looking at Marissa Holloway from a distance for 5 years and quietly cataloging her as someone worth waiting for. Aldercrest had given her a cardboard box. She didn't let herself feel the full weight of that yet. She couldn't afford to feel the full weight of that yet. She had phone calls to prepare for, and notes to organize, and a daughter who needed dinner on the table, and who had asked that morning, with the particular careful casualness of a 17-year-old who is pretending not to be worried, whether everything was going to be okay. Yeah, Marissa had told her. It's going to be okay. She'd meant it more than she expected. What she didn't know yet, what she couldn't know, sitting at that kitchen table with her phone and her journal and the cup of coffee that had gone cold, was that 3 blocks away, inside the Aldercrest Health Systems Operations Center, a clock was already running. Not a metaphorical clock, a real one. A processing cycle deadline built into the infrastructure of the largest hospital contract the company had. A deadline that depended on a routing architecture that had a fault line buried in it, invisible and waiting. A fault line that Marissa had identified 6 months ago and documented in an email she had sent to Gavin Mercer on a Thursday afternoon, and received a 2-sentence reply to one that said the engineering team had reviewed the matter and considered it low risk. The engineering team had not, in fact, reviewed the matter in any serious way. Gavin had forwarded the email, received a reassurance, accepted it, and moved on. The fault line was still there, and the person who knew exactly where it was and exactly how to fix it was sitting at her kitchen table, looking at emails from people who were already treating her like the professional she had always been. Back at Aldercrest, Sienna Cross was settling into a larger desk. She had fresh business cards. She had a new title. She had the confidence of someone who had wanted something for a long time and had finally been handed it, and she was working hard to appear more certain than she felt, which is something that 28-year-olds with good credentials and limited real-world operational experience are sometimes very good at in the first week. The processing cycle would run in 72 hours. None of this was on Marissa's mind when she opened her laptop that evening and sent the follow-up email to Robert and confirmed the call with Delphine and texted Carlos back with a time. She was thinking about Kira's college applications. She was thinking about whether she'd remembered to water the replacement cactus she'd bought to put on the windowsill, since the original was now sitting in a cardboard box. She was thinking about how it had felt to sit in that conference room with the termination letter sliding across the table at her, and how she'd said the one true thing she'd wanted to say, and how she'd walked out with her spine straight even though every muscle in her body had been telling her to either scream or dissolve. She was thinking that maybe she had spent 12 years being so focused on what she owed the company that she had forgotten to notice what the company owed her. 3 days from now, she would receive a phone call. It would be from a number she recognized, and the man on the other end of it would say 4 words that would change what happened next. But tonight, she watered the cactus and read Kira's essay draft and told her it was good. It was good, with 2 specific sentences she needed to revisit, and then she went to bed. And for the first time In longer than she could easily remember, she slept the full night through. The call came on a Thursday morning, 41 hours after the processing cycle had begun eating itself alive inside Aldercrest's billing infrastructure. Marissa was at Delphine Carroll's office, a converted row house in Midtown that smelled like real coffee and competence, the kind of space built by someone who had walked away from corporate and never looked back with anything resembling regret. They were 3 hours into a conversation that had stopped feeling like an interview somewhere around the 90-minute mark and started feeling like a negotiation between two people who already understood they were going to work together, the only remaining question being the terms. Marissa's phone was face down on the table beside her legal pad. She'd told herself she wouldn't look at it. She'd kept that promise for 3 hours. When it buzzed and she flipped it over and saw the number, her hand went very still. Delphine noticed. Someone important? Marissa looked at the name on the screen. Gavin Mercer office line. Not his cell. His office line, which meant he'd made a deliberate choice to call from the desk, which meant he wanted to project some version of formality or authority, which meant he was already failing to manage the situation and didn't know it yet. Someone who used to think he was, Marissa said. She let it ring twice more. Then she picked up. Marissa. His voice was different. The practiced smoothness he used in meetings was mostly intact, but underneath it was something tight, something wound up, and trying not to show how wound up it was. Gavin. A pause. The kind of pause that happens when someone has rehearsed an opening line and is discovering in real time that it doesn't fit the moment. I wanted to reach out personally, he said. There's a situation developing that we're having some challenges with the Meridian account. System-related. Another pause. She could almost hear him recalibrating. We thought it might be worth having a conversation about whether there's a role you could play in. Gavin. She kept her voice flat and even. Is the Meridian billing queue processing? Silence. Is it processing? She asked again. There are some routing irregularities. How many claims? We're still assessing how many claims are stuck. It wasn't a question. He heard the difference. Several hundred at present, he said. But the team is actively working. Several hundred. She let that sit for a moment. When did it start? Yesterday evening. Which cycle? The Tuesday overnight run. Marissa closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. She knew which part of the system the Tuesday overnight run touched. She knew because she had written a 22-page internal memo about exactly this 18 months ago and a follow-up email 6 months ago and received in response to both the corporate equivalent of a pat on the head. How much of the routing table is corrupted? She asked. We don't. The team is still determining the scope of Gavin. Stop talking in department meeting language. Is it the insurance classification layer or the payer routing layer? He hesitated long enough that she had her answer. Both, he finally said. She opened her eyes. Delphine was watching her from across the table with an expression that was carefully neutral and absolutely attentive. I'll call you back, Marissa said. Marissa, so we really need. She ended the call. She set the phone down on the table and looked at the legal pad in front of her. She'd drawn a small grid in the corner of it while they talked, the kind of unconscious doodling she did when she was processing information. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked up at Delphine. I think I need to postpone our next meeting, Marissa said. How bad is it? If it's what I think it is, they have maybe 72 hours before Meridian pulls the contract. Delphine was quiet for a moment. Then, and you're the only one who knows how to fix it. I'm the only one who knows where the problem actually started. Delphine leaned back slightly. You don't owe them anything. No, Marissa agreed. I don't. She picked up her bag and her legal pad and the pen she'd been using. She stood up. She extended her hand and Delphine shook it, and there was something in the handshake that communicated a complete sentence. Something like, I understand exactly what you're doing and why, and I'll be here when you've done it. Before you walk back in there, Delphine said, make sure they know what they're asking for. Marissa nodded once. They're going to find that out. She walked out into the Atlanta morning, the air thick and warm the way it gets in early autumn when the heat hasn't decided to leave yet. She sat in her car and she called Gavin back. He picked up before the first ring finished. I'll come in, she said, but we're going to discuss terms first. I'm not walking back into that building as a favor. Of course we want to make this right. I'm not interested in you making anything right. I'm interested in a contract, independent consulting, 60 days minimum with a 30-day extension option. My billing rate is twice my former salary, annualized and divided to an hourly. I will need complete operational access every system, every log, every vendor contact. I will not report to you. A brief pause. I'll provide status updates directly to Leonard's office. The silence that followed had a specific texture to it. The texture of a man who needed her badly enough to swallow everything that sentence meant. Leonard may want to be involved in. That's fine. He can be involved. You can be present for status meetings. But I will not take direction from you on the technical resolution. Not one word, Marissa. I don't think it's productive to. And Sienna Cross stays out of my way. Another silence. Shorter this time. Sienna is leading the response team, Gavin said, with some attempt at recovering authority. She's been working through the night to... I know she has, Marissa said. And I know exactly what she's found, which is that nothing she's tried has worked. Gavin. Her voice didn't rise. It just got quieter, which was somehow worse. You need me. We both know it. We can spend the next 20 minutes managing each other's feelings about that fact. Or you can agree to my terms, and I can come in this afternoon. The claims aren't going to stop stacking while we're having this conversation. She heard him breathe. She heard him calculate. Send me the terms in writing, he said. I'll have HR review. I'll send you the terms when I'm in the lobby. You'll sign them before I badge in, or I go home. She ended the call again. She sat with both hands on the steering wheel and looked at the parking meter in front of her. She thought about the cardboard box. She thought about the sound of someone laughing through the glass wall. She thought about the email she'd sent 6 months ago and the 2-sentence reply. She put the car in drive. Back inside Aldercrest, the morning had already gone wrong in several directions at once. The operations floor had the specific energy of a place where people are working very hard and accomplishing very little, the kind of frantic activity that generates heat without generating solutions. Sienna Cross had been there since 7 the previous evening, and it showed. Her blazer was draped over the back of her chair. Her hair was pulled back with the kind of urgency you reserve for moments when you've stopped caring about appearances, and the dark patches under her eyes had reached the point where even concealer had stopped making the effort. She had 3 vendor calls running simultaneously on 2 different laptops. She had a whiteboard covered in routing diagrams that she kept adding to and then partially erasing. She had Marcus from IT at a station beside her running error logs that had become so voluminous they'd had to archive the first 40 hours of data just to keep the interface manageable. She was not, by any measure, failing to try. The problem was that trying without understanding the foundational architecture was like running diagnostics on a car without knowing the engine had been modified. You could read every gauge correctly and still be completely wrong about what the readings meant. At 9:14 that morning, Sienna's vendor call with the system's primary insurance routing provider escalated from a troubleshooting session to something considerably more tense. I'm telling you the configuration is correct. The vendor rep, his name was Tom, and he'd been on the call for 6 hours, and his patience had developed visible fault lines, said, "The routing rules your team is looking at match our implementation guide exactly." Then why are claims dropping? Sienna asked. I don't know, but it's not on our end. You updated the system 6 months ago. Did you test the insurance classification layer against our existing payer table? A pause. That would have been part of the standard testing protocol. I'm asking if it was done. Specifically, with our payer table. Another pause. Longer. I'd need to pull the deployment records. Pull them, Sienna said. Marcus glanced at her sideways. She caught it. What? She said, not a question. Just a word. Nothing. Marcus, what? He turned back to his screen. There's an email in the archived ops folder, pre-Sienna. He caught himself. From a while back, flagging a potential conflict in the insurance routing module. Sienna's chair was already moving. She was behind him in 3 seconds, leaning over his shoulder, reading the screen. The email was dated 6 months and 12 days ago. The sender was Marissa Holloway. The subject line was, Urgent Update Deployment, Risk. Insurance Routing Conflict Action Required. Sienna read it. Then she read it again. Then she stood up straight and put both hands on the back of Marcus's chair and stared at the wall above his monitor. The email was specific. It wasn't vague concern or general caution. It was a precise technical description of a potential incompatibility between the update's revised insurance classification framework and the existing payer routing table, that Aldercrest had been running since its 2019 system integration. It recommended delay. It recommended a specific stress test. It named the exact claims processing cycle that would be most vulnerable. It was the Tuesday overnight run. Who did she send this to? Sienna's voice was very controlled. Gavin CC'd to the VP of IT and the vendor project manager. And the response? Marcus scrolled down without saying anything. Gavin's reply was 4 lines. It thanked Marissa for her concern, noted that the engineering team had reviewed the matter and assessed the risk as manageable, and directed her to proceed with the standard update deployment timeline. Sienna freed the 4 lines 3 times. Don't show this to anyone yet, she said. Marcus turned in his chair to look at her. Sienna, I'm not saying hide it. I'm saying wait until I've talked to Gavin. Give me 30 minutes. Sienna, this is 30 minutes, Marcus. She walked to Gavin's office with her hands in her pockets because she needed something to do with them, and her face was doing something she didn't fully trust. She knocked on the open door. Gavin was on his phone. He held up one finger without looking at her. She waited. He wrapped the call. He looked at her. He read something in her expression that made him put his phone face down on the desk. We found an email, Sienna said. She kept her voice low and even. In the archived ops folder. From Marissa. 6 months ago. She watched his face do the thing faces do when a person is deciding how to respond to information they already know. I'm aware of the email, he said. You dismissed her recommendation. I made a decision based on the assessment I've received from... You told her it was fine. You told her the team reviewed it. Did they? The IT team. Did they review her specific concern? The routing conflict she described? Because what she described 6 months ago is exactly what's happening right now, Gavin. Word for word. He stood up, not aggressively, just with the energy of a man who wants to occupy more space in a room when he feels cornered. This is a complex situation with multiple contributing factors, he said. It wouldn't be accurate to reduce it to. She told you. Sienna's voice cracked slightly on the second word, and she pressed her lips together for a moment. She told you, and you didn't listen, and you fired her, and now we have $2 million in stuck claims, and Meridian is calling twice a day. The number landed in the room like something dropped from a height. 2 million? Gavin's voice changed as of this morning's count. She held his gaze. It was 800,000 yesterday afternoon. He sat back down. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Outside the glass wall of his office, the operations floor continued its frantic, useless motion. People moving between stations, phones ringing, keyboards clicking, all of it generating nothing useful, because the person who would have known what to do was at home, or at a coffee meeting, or anywhere but here. Then Gavin's phone buzzed. He looked at it. Something in his expression shifted. She's in the lobby, he said. Sienna blinked. What? Marissa. He was already picking up his desk phone. She's in the lobby. She called me earlier this morning. Sienna stood very still. You called her. I made a call, yes. The situation. You fired her 4 days ago, and now you called her. The situation requires, does she know? Sienna's voice dropped to something that was barely above a whisper. About the email. Does she know you're going to know she was right? Gavin looked at her with an expression that told her he had not yet thought about this from that angle and was not enjoying thinking about it now. Handle the vendor call, he said. I'll go to the lobby. Gavin. She stepped in front of his desk without quite meaning to. Whatever terms she's asking for, just say yes. He stopped. She's not going to come cheap, Sienna said. And she's not going to come humble. Whatever she's asking, we don't have a position to negotiate from. Just say yes and get her up here before Meridian makes another call. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he walked past her without responding. In the lobby, Marissa was standing near the security desk with her laptop bag over her shoulder and a single-page document in her hand. She had dressed deliberately not the charcoal blazer of the firing. Something different. Something that said she was here as a professional engaged for a specific purpose, not as a returning employee and not as someone who needed to prove anything. She looked calm. She wasn't calm. Underneath the stillness was something wired and alert. The particular state of a person who has decided on a course of action and committed to it completely, and is now running entirely on execution. Feelings deferred until later. Gavin appeared from the elevator. He crossed the lobby. He was wearing the expression of a man performing confidence. She held out the document before he reached her. He took it. He read it. She watched him read it. She watched the exact moment he reached the rate clause. He started. Non-negotiable, flat. Certain. Not angry. Just factual. Marissa, the rate you're proposing is it's significantly appropriate for the situation you're in, she said, which you created. She let that sit for exactly 1 second. You can spend 20 minutes telling me it's too high, or you can sign it and I can go upstairs. Meridian's next check-in call is at 2 o'clock this afternoon. It would be nice if we had something to tell them. That isn't. We're still assessing. He looked at the document again. He looked at her. He took the pen she was already holding out to him. He signed. She took the document back. She folded it, put it in the outside pocket of her bag. She walked to the elevator. He followed. They rode up together in the kind of silence that is not comfortable and not meant to be. When the doors opened on the 14th floor, Marissa stepped out first, and the operations floor registered her arrival in the same way a room registers. A sudden change in air pressure, not loudly, not all at once, but in a ripple of stilled movement and redirected attention. She didn't look around. She walked directly to the operations center. Sienna was on the phone. When she saw Marissa, she went very still for about 2 seconds. Then she said something brief to whoever was on the line and set the receiver down. They looked at each other across the room. 48 hours ago, Sienna Cross had been sitting with a coffee mug watching Marissa carry a cardboard box across this floor. Now Marissa was standing at the entrance to the operations center in her own capacity, with a signed contract in her bag, and the entire floor was trying to look like it wasn't watching. Sienna stood up. She walked toward Marissa. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The routing logs are on station 3, Sienna said. I've pulled everything from the Tuesday cycle. The vendor is on hold on line 2. Marissa looked at her. Really looked at her, not through her, not past her, but at her. The exhaustion, the specific brand of desperate competence that had kept a person working through the night on a problem they didn't fully understand. Show me what you've tried, Marissa said. It wasn't warm. It wasn't hostile. It was the voice of someone who had a job to do and had already decided how she was going to do it. Sienna showed her. For the next 40 minutes, Marissa moved through the logs like someone who knew exactly where to look, which she did, because she had built the institutional memory of this system, one crisis at a time for 12 years. And it was all still in her head, organized the way only lived experience can organize information, by feeling in consequence and the specific texture of each failure she'd been present for. She found what she needed at the 11:40 mark, in the Tuesday overnight log, not in the routing table itself, not in the payer list, in the timestamp metadata of a batch process that had tried to reconcile the old routing logic with the new classification framework and failed silently. No error flag, no alert, no notification, just a silent failure that propagated forward through every subsequent claim, like a crack moving through concrete, invisible until the weight became too much. She sat back. Marcus, who had been watching her work for 30 minutes without saying a word, said quietly, "You found it." "I found it." She pulled up the archived folder. She typed a search term into the email archive. The email appeared on screen. Her email, 6 months ago. She read the subject line. She read her own words. She read Gavin's 4-line response below them. The room had gotten very quiet. Gavin was standing 8 feet behind her. She hadn't heard him approach. She didn't turn around. "I sent you this on a Thursday," she said. Her voice was level. "I described this exact failure mode. I told you which cycle it would hit. I recommended we delay the update by 30 days and run a stress test on the routing module. Nobody in the room said anything. You told me the team reviewed it." She still hadn't turned around. "Did anyone actually review it?" Silence. She turned around. Gavin was standing with his hands in his pockets and his jaw set in the particular way of a man who is holding himself very still because the alternative is worse. The vendor assessed based on their standard protocol, not based on our specific payer table, not based on the 2019 integration we still haven't fully migrated away from. Her voice did not rise. It got slower, if anything, more deliberate. "I told you all of this, in writing, with my name on it." The room was absolutely silent now. Sienna was standing to Marissa's left. She had heard Gavin's four-line reply for the first time an hour ago, and she was still carrying the weight of it, visible in the set of her shoulders. The email was escalated, Gavin said. To whom? To the IT leadership. And what was their assessment? Marissa asked. Can you show me that assessment? An email, a memo, a meeting note, anything? He didn't answer, because there was no assessment. There was a forwarded email and a verbal reassurance, and a decision to keep on to deployment on schedule because changing the deployment timeline would have required Gavin to go to Leonard Voss with a delay he couldn't fully explain to someone who'd been pushing for the update to be completed. Everyone in that room understood this without it being said. Gavin understood that everyone understood it. He turned and walked back toward his office without a word. Marissa turned back to the screen. Marcus, she said, get Tom from the vendor back online too. Tell him I need the original deployment logs from the October update, specifically the reconciliation batch records for the insurance classification module. Yeah, Marcus said. He was already picking up the phone. Sienna. She kept her voice even. I need you on station 4. Pull up the current payer routing table and filter for every entry added or modified after October 15th. Sienna moved without hesitation. Marissa pulled up the archived email one more time. She looked at it for 3 seconds. Then she minimized it, opened a new terminal window, and started typing. The work was just beginning. And somewhere in the middle of it, somewhere between the third vendor call and the moment Marcus found the reconciliation batch record that confirmed everything she'd already suspected, Marissa stopped thinking about the cardboard box and the glass wall and the sound of someone laughing. She stopped thinking about Gavin's 4-line reply and the 12 years and the charcoal blazer. She focused on the problem, because the problem was real, and the people who would lose their jobs if the Meridian contract collapsed were real. And whatever Aldercrest had done to her, those people were not the ones who had done it. She was 47 lines deep into the reconciliation log when she found the root record. A single line, a timestamp from 6 months and 11 days ago one day, before Gavin had sent her the dismissive reply. A silent system flag that no one had noticed because no one had been looking for it, because the person who would have been looking for it had been told it wasn't necessary. She highlighted it. She looked at it. Then she called across the room, her voice completely steady. I've got it. The operations center went absolutely still. And in that stillness, 3 things were simultaneously true. The problem could be fixed. The disaster had been entirely preventable. And the evidence of both was now sitting on a screen in the middle of a room, full of people who were all about to have to reckon with what it meant. Marissa saved the file. She printed the reconciliation record. She picked up the phone to call the vendor's engineering team directly, not Tom, not the account manager, the actual engineers who had written the classification module. And when Gavin emerged from his office 20 minutes later to ask for an update, she handed him the printed record without looking away from her screen. He read it. She heard him exhale. This goes to Leonard, she said. We should discuss how to frame. It goes to Leonard tonight. She turned then. Fully. Directly. You can decide how to frame your part of it. That's your business. The technical record goes to Leonard, unedited, exactly as it is. That's not a request. He held the paper. He looked at the operations center at Marcus and Sienna and the 3 other analysts who had stopped pretending to work on other things. He looked back at Marissa. He nodded once, and then he went back to his office and closed the door. Sienna let out a breath she'd apparently been holding for some time. She looked at Marissa with an expression that contained several things at once: exhaustion, something close to relief, and underneath both of those, something quieter and harder to name. Is it fixable? Sienna asked. Tonight? Marissa looked at the screen, at the log, at the scope of what had silently accumulated for 6 months, while no one was paying the right kind of attention. It's fixable, she said, but it's going to be a very long night. Sienna looked at her for one more moment. Then she pulled her chair closer to Station 3, and the 2 of them, the woman who had been pushed out and the woman who had, in part, benefited from that pushing, sat down together in front of a problem that neither of them could solve alone, and got to work. The clock on the operations center wall read 11:47 when the vendor's lead engineer finally confirmed what Marissa had already known for 3 hours. His name was Devanand, and he had been patched in from Atlanta's Eastern Seaboard office at Marissa's specific request, not through the account management chain, not through Tom, but through a direct call she'd made to a personal contact she'd built over 4 years of working alongside his team during system integrations. Dev picked up because Marissa asked him to. He stayed on because what she showed him made his voice go very quiet, in the way voices go quiet when a technical professional is looking at something that reflects badly on work they were part of. The reconciliation batch, he said for the third time. Not a question. Just a man repeating words back to himself. The reconciliation batch, Marissa confirmed. It ran at 2:14 a.m. on the night of the October deployment. It hit the conflict between the new classification framework and the legacy payer table, generated an internal error flag, suppressed it automatically because the suppression threshold was set too high, and continued processing as though nothing had happened. That suppression threshold shouldn't have been. It was set during the 2019 integration, Marissa said. It was never adjusted for the October build. Nobody checked because nobody knew to check, because the person who flagged the risk was told the risk was manageable. A silence on the line that had a particular quality to it. How many claims are we looking at currently? Dev asked. Marcus typed something, looked at his screen, said, without inflection, $2.3 million as of the 11 p.m. cycle count. Another silence. Dev. Marissa's voice was steady, but there was something under it now, not anger exactly. More like the last layer of patience a person holds onto when they have been right about something for a very long time and are now watching the cost of being ignored accumulate in real numbers on a screen. I need your engineering team to push a patch to the suppression threshold tonight, not tomorrow morning. Tonight. And I need the classification framework rolled back to a compatibility layer that bridges the legacy payer table until we can do a proper migration. A full rollback is going to take. I'm not asking for a full rollback. I'm asking for a bridge layer. Your team built one for the 2021 Southeast Regional deployment. I have the documentation. I can send it to you in the next 10 minutes. A pause. You have our internal deployment documentation? I have everything relevant to Aldercrest system history, Marissa said. I kept records. What she didn't say, and didn't need to say, was that she had kept those records because she had learned early that in an organization that underdocumented everything, the person who documented was the person who survived crises. She had not, at the time, anticipated that surviving a crisis would mean doing it from outside the organization that generated it. But here they were. Send me the documentation, Dev said. Give me 40 minutes to pull the team together. You have 35. Meridian's next processing cycle initiates at 1:15 a.m. She heard him exhale. Send it now, he said. She was already pulling up the files. Beside her, Sienna had been working through the payer routing table for 2 hours, flagging every entry that had been modified post-October. With a color-coded system, she'd built herself in a spreadsheet, methodical and precise in a way that Marissa was watching with one corner of her attention. The girl was not stupid. She had never been stupid. What she'd lacked was context, the specific, unglamorous, accumulated context that only comes from being present for enough failures to recognize the shape of them before they fully form. Sienna. Marissa kept her eyes on her own screen while she talked. The payer entries flagged in orange, any of them, in the Medicaid supplemental category? Sienna scrolled. 3. Entries 4,000, 471, 4,000, 472, and 4,489. Those 3 are the ones feeding the Tuesday overnight run. Cross-reference them with the reconciliation batch timestamps. From Dev's original deployment log, I'm sending it to your station now. The sound of keys, a pause. They match, Sienna said. Her voice had a particular quality, flat. But underneath the flatness, something that was almost like the moment before understanding fully arrives, when the shape of a thing becomes visible, but the full weight of it hasn't landed yet. All 3 modified timestamps fall inside the reconciliation batch window. That's the corrupted seed, Marissa said. Those 3 entries were partially overwritten during the batch process, and they've been pushing bad routing data into every Tuesday cycle since October. Sienna stared at her screen. We've been running corrupted data for 6 months, she said. Since 2:14 a.m. on October 9th, yes. And nobody, Sienna stopped. Started again. None of the processing alerts caught it. The alerts were calibrated to catch claim rejection rates above a specific threshold. What this did was reroute claims to incorrect payer channels, not reject them. Rejection rates stayed normal. The claims were just going to the wrong places. And the payments were going to the wrong places too, or getting stuck in reclassification queues that nobody was monitoring because nothing was flagging as broken. Marissa's voice was completely even. The system thought it was working. It was just working wrong. Sienna put her hand flat on the desk. Not a dramatic gesture, more like someone who needs a surface to press against while they process something. How much money, she said, total. Not just the stuck claims. How much has been misrouted since October? Marcus looked at Marissa. Marissa looked at her screen. She had been doing this math for the past hour, quietly, building the estimate from cycle data and average claim values and the routing error rate she'd extrapolated from the 3 corrupted cease entries. She had not said the number out loud yet. She said it now. Conservatively, somewhere between $8 and $12 million in misrouted or delayed claims across the full Meridian network since October. The operations center went so quiet that Marissa could hear the ventilation hum in the ceiling. Marcus made a sound that was not quite a word. Sienna didn't make any sound at all. The stuck $2.3 million is just what's visible, Marissa continued. It's the backlog that finally got large enough to trigger client complaints. The rest has been bleeding quietly for 6 months into incorrect payer accounts or reclassification limbo. Some of it will be recoverable. Some of it won't be, depending on claim filing deadlines. She kept her voice clinical because clinical was the only way she could say these numbers without the full weight of them landing on her, on the part of her that had sent an email 6 months ago and been told not to worry about it. Marissa. Sienna's voice was careful. Does Leonard know the full number? He knows what's in the memo I sent upstairs an hour ago, which is the technical root cause and the 2.3 million figure. She pulled up a new window. He doesn't have the full historical scope yet because I only completed the estimate 20 minutes ago. Sienna stood up. She pulled on her blazer, the one she'd draped over her chair 12 hours ago. She smoothed the front of it with both hands. I'll take it upstairs, she said. Marissa looked at her. That's not your... I'll take it upstairs, Sienna said again. Not defiant. Something else. Something that looked, in the harsh light of the operations center at midnight, like a person deciding to stop managing the appearance of a situation and start taking responsibility for their actual position in it. It should come from someone who was involved in the response from the beginning, and it should go to Leonard directly, not to Gavin. Marissa looked at her for 3 full seconds. The estimate document is on Station 3. Print it. Don't editorialize. Just the numbers and the timeline. Sienna nodded. She printed it. She took the pages from the printer and straightened them without looking at them again. The way you don't look at a hard thing twice once you've decided to carry it. She walked toward the elevator. Marissa watched her go. Then she turned back to her screen and kept working, because Dev was going to call back in 28 minutes, and she needed the bridge layer parameters ready when he did. What she didn't know, and what the elevator doors closed on without telling her, was that the night was about to get significantly worse. Leonard Voss's office was on the 22nd floor, and at 12:17 in the morning it was lit and occupied because Leonard Voss had not gone home. He had been there since Gavin's initial briefing that afternoon, and in the intervening hours, he had made 4 phone calls to the Meridian executive team and received 3 of them returned, and the 4th, the one to Meridian's CEO, had not been returned, which told him more about the state of the relationship than any of the conversations had. He was 61 years old, and he had been running Aldercrest for 9 years, and he had weathered billing disputes and compliance, audits, and 2 economic downturns, and a pandemic-era contraction that had nearly halved their hospital client roster. He was not a man who panicked, but he was also not a man who was comfortable with what he'd been reading in the memos coming up from the 14th floor, and he was even less comfortable with what Gavin had been telling him, which was a version of events that kept putting the emphasis in places that felt, to Leonard's experienced ear, slightly off. When Sienna knocked and entered, he looked at her for a moment, with the expression of someone who has been waiting for information, and has some doubts about whether the information he's about to receive is complete. "Miss Cross," he said, "sit down." She sat. She placed the papers on the edge of his desk. She did not push them toward him, the way Gavin had pushed the termination letter toward Marissa 4 days ago. She just placed them there and waited. He picked them up. He read. Sienna watched his face move through the stages of reading something significantly worse than you were prepared for. The initial neutral absorption. The slight change around the eyes. The moment where the hands go still because the brain has caught something and is making itself reread it. He read the full historical estimate. He set the papers down. 8 to 12 million, he said. Conservatively, Sienna said. Marissa's estimate. It could be higher depending on what we find when we do a full audit of the misrouted claims. Since October. Since the October deployment.
Yes.
He was quiet for a moment. Then, and this was flagged. It wasn't a question. Sienna understood it wasn't a question. There's an email in the archive, she said, from Marissa Holloway. 6 months ago. She identified the risk before the deployment and recommended a delay and a specific stress test on the routing module. Who received that email? Gavin, the VP of IT, the vendor project manager, and the response. Gavin replied that the engineering team had reviewed the matter and assessed the risk as manageable. She paused. There's no documentation of any engineering review. I looked for it. Leonard Voss sat back in his chair. He pressed his index finger against his lips and looked at the papers on his desk with the specific expression of a man who is constructing a complete picture from pieces that have been, until now, handed to him separately by people with interests in how the picture looked when assembled. Where is Gavin now? He said. His office, I believe. Leonard looked at the clock on his wall. 12:22 a.m. Go back downstairs, he said. Help Marissa. Don't let anything derail the technical work. He picked up his phone. I'll handle the rest. Sienna stood. She was almost at the door when he said her name. She stopped. The email, he said. The one Marissa sent 6 months ago. Who decided she didn't need to be here to see the consequences of it being ignored? Sienna stood in the doorway. The question had a specific architecture to it. It wasn't really asking who made the termination decision, because Leonard knew who made termination decisions. It was asking something else. It was asking who specifically had looked at Marissa Holloway and decided she was the kind of problem you solved by removing rather than the kind of asset you protected by listening. Gavin recommended the restructure, Sienna said carefully. I supported the recommendation, she said clearly, without qualification, because she was done qualifying. Leonard held her gaze. Go downstairs, he said again. She went. In the elevator between the 22nd floor and the 14th, Sienna Cross stood with her back against the wall and her hands at her sides and her eyes on the ceiling, and she breathed the way you breathe when you are preventing something from happening to your face that you don't want to happen in a public space. She had supported the recommendation. She had stood in Gavin's office 6 weeks before the termination and nodded while he laid out his rationale, which was dressed up in language about strategic direction and talent realignment and fresh perspectives. And underneath all of it was something simpler and uglier that she had chosen not to name to herself because naming it would have required her to then do something about it. She had wanted the larger role. She had wanted the title. She had looked at Marissa Holloway, the quiet, methodical, seemingly permanent fixture of the operations center, and she had made an assessment that she was now understanding in the elevator at 12:23 in the morning had been built entirely on the surface of a thing she had never bothered to look under. The elevator opened. She walked back into the operations center. Marissa was on the phone with Dev. She was reading numbers from a document on her screen, her voice clipped and precise, no wasted words. Marcus was at the station beside her, running something in a terminal window, watching the output scroll. Sienna sat down at Station 4. She pulled up the payer routing table. She kept working. At 12:51, Dev's team pushed the patch. At 12:58, Marissa ran the first test claim through the corrected routing sequence. It processed. Marcus said, "Oh, thank," and then stopped himself and just exhaled very loudly. Marissa ran 5 more test claims, then 10, then a batch of 50. They all processed. She sat back. She rolled her neck once to the left, once to the right. The vertebrae made a sound that suggested she'd been hunched over a screen for approximately the past 7 hours, without meaningful interruption, which she had. "Start the queue," she said. Marcus initiated the backlog processing sequence. The first claim cleared at 1:03 a.m., 47 seconds before the Meridian processing cycle deadline. Marissa watched the counter, watched it move. Claims clearing, one after another, the stuck backlog beginning to drain. She should have felt something uncomplicated in that moment. Relief, maybe, or the specific satisfaction of a technical problem correctly solved. She had felt those things before, had felt them in this exact room, at this exact hour, after this exact kind of work. What she felt instead was something with more edges to it, because the counter was climbing, and the claims were clearing, and the crisis was resolving, and sitting 6 feet to her left was a 28-year-old woman who had, 4 days ago, stood in this room with a coffee mug and watched her walk to the elevator with a cardboard box. And somewhere on the 22nd floor, a conversation was happening that she had not been invited to and had not asked to be part of. She found out what was said in that conversation at 2:47 in the morning when Leonard Voss stepped off the elevator onto the 14th floor. He walked into the operations center. He looked at the screens. He looked at the claim counter. He looked at Marissa. "Walk with me," he said. She followed him to the small glass-walled room, off the main floor, not the large conference room, the one they used for client presentations, but the smaller one used for internal meetings, the one with the round table and the 4 chairs and the whiteboard, still covered in Sienna's routing diagrams from the previous day. He closed the door. He sat down. She sat across from him. Leonard Voss was the kind of man who had learned, over a long career, to remove all emotional editorial from his face during difficult conversations so that the person across from him had no signal to read and no direction to calibrate toward. He did this now. He sat with his hands folded on the table and his face completely neutral, and he looked at her. "The full audit is going to take several weeks," he said. "But based on your estimate, we're looking at a potential $8 to $12 million exposure in misrouted claims, 6 months of system compromise, and a client relationship with Meridian that is currently being held together by the fact that their billing director has not yet spoken with their CEO." "That's accurate," Marissa said. "This started before you left." "Yes, you flagged it in writing 6 months ago." He nodded once, not in surprise, more in the way someone nods when a thing they suspected is confirmed. "Gavin will be stepping back from operational authority immediately," Leonard said. "He'll remain in an advisory capacity during the transition. Contractually, we need to manage the separation carefully, but he will have no further decision-making authority over client systems or operations personnel." Marissa absorbed this without visible reaction. "The next question," Leonard said, "is what comes next." He unfolded his hands and placed them flat on the table. "I want to offer you a position." "I have a position," Marissa said. "I'm a contractor, 3 months. The contract you've already signed. I mean a permanent position, a new position." He held her gaze. "VP of Client Systems and Operations. Newly created. Full executive authority over the technical operations team, client system architecture, and implementation decisions. Your own budget. Direct report to me." The room was very quiet. Marissa looked at him. She was aware of her own breathing, the specific steadiness she was maintaining by not thinking too hard about what was being said, because thinking about it would mean feeling it, and feeling it would mean something happening to her face that she wasn't going to allow to happen in this room, in front of this man, at 2:47 in the morning, in a building where someone had laughed when she walked out with her box. "That position didn't exist 4 days ago," she said. "No. It didn't exist because nobody thought it needed to." "That's correct. And now someone does." "I do," Leonard said. Simply, without the corporate language Gavin used as insulation. "Just I do." She looked at the whiteboard, at Sienna's routing diagrams, at the dry erase lines and arrows that represented Sienna's best effort to understand a system she'd been handed without a map. "I have conditions," she said. Something in Leonard's face shifted slightly. It's not surprise, more like recognition, like a man who prepared for something and is now watching it arrive on schedule. "I assumed you would," he said. She took a breath, and that was when the door opened. Not Leonard's door, the glass door of the small conference room. It opened and Gavin Mercer was standing in it, and his tie was loosened, and his face had the specific look of a man who has spent the last 2 hours in his office doing calculations and has arrived at a number he doesn't like. Leonard looked at him. This isn't a good time, Gavin. I heard she's in here. He stepped inside. He didn't look at Leonard. He looked at Marissa. I want to know what you told him. Gavin, Leonard said. What did you tell him about the email? About the deployment decision? Marissa looked at him. She had the same stillness she'd had in the large conference room 4 days ago when the termination letter was sliding across the table. The same composure that had made him visibly uncomfortable then and was making him visibly uncomfortable now, but with considerably more urgency. I told him what happened, she said, which is what's in the email, which is in the archive, which has been there for 6 months. You're making it sound like I deliberately. I'm making it sound like what it is, she said, which is that you received a specific, documented warning from a technical specialist with 12 years of operational knowledge, dismissed it, made a deployment decision that introduced a system fault, and then eliminated the specialist who could have fixed it before the fault became a crisis. That's not your oversimplifying a complex, Gavin. Her voice was very quiet, very still. There are $2.3 million in stuck claims in a processing queue downstairs. There are potentially $12 million in misrouted payments that have been bleeding out of this system since October. I have an email with my name on it that predicted this specific failure mode 6 months ago. What is the version of this that doesn't start with you ignoring that email? He opened his mouth, he closed it. He opened it again. You wanted to be right, he said. And his voice had changed. The authority had dropped out of it, and what was underneath was something rawer and less managed. You have always wanted to be the one who was right. Every meeting, every decision, every time someone brought in a new idea, you were the one who found the problem with it. You were the one who said, slow down. Wait, let me check. Let me verify. You made everyone feel like they were moving too fast for you to keep up. Marissa looked at him. And maybe, he said, and his voice was shaking slightly now, in a way she didn't think he was fully aware of. Maybe that was just as much the problem as anything I did. The room was completely silent. Leonard had gone very still. Marissa let the silence stay for 3 full seconds. Moving too fast, she said slowly, is what got $2.3 million stuck in a queue at 1 in the morning. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Moving too fast is why Meridian's billing director is going to have to explain to his board why 6 months of claims were processed through corrupted routing. Moving too fast is why you're in this room at 3 in the morning, watching someone you fired 7 days ago try to save your client contract. She paused. I didn't make you feel like you were moving too fast, Gavin. I made you feel like you should slow down. Those are different things. Gavin stood in the doorway of the small conference room, and the specific quality of his silence was the silence of a man who has nothing left to say that won't make the situation worse, which is one of the loneliest silences there is. Leonard stood up. Gavin, he said. His voice was not unkind, but it was completely final. Go home. I'll call you tomorrow afternoon. Gavin looked at Leonard, then at Marissa, then at the floor. Then he left. The door closed. Leonard sat back down. Marissa and Leonard looked at each other across the round table. Outside the glass wall, the operations center continued its work. Marcus at his station, Sienna at hers. The claim counter still climbing, the backlog draining. Your conditions, Leonard said. She looked at her hands. They were steady. She was surprised they were steady. She was not, underneath the surface, as calm as her hands appeared. First, she said, the operations documentation system gets rebuilt from the ground up. No more institutional knowledge held in individual people's heads with no formal record. Everything gets documented, properly, by people who are paid and given time to document it. Agreed. Second, she said, I won't fire Sienna Cross. Leonard raised an eyebrow slightly. That wasn't something I was planning to ask you to. She made a bad decision, Marissa said. She made it because she was put in a position she wasn't ready for, by someone who had reasons that had nothing to do with her readiness. She looked at the routing diagrams on the whiteboard. She has capacity. She needs development. I'll determine the structure of that. Agreed. Third, she paused. Final approval on all major system changes affecting client infrastructure. Not sign-off after the fact. Actual approval before implementation. No exceptions. Agreed. The word kept arriving without negotiation, without the corporate dance of counteroffers and red-line terms. and each time it arrived, it added a small weight to the space between them, the weight of a recognition that was long overdue, and both of them knew it, and neither of them was going to say so directly, because the hour was late, and the crisis was still technically in progress, and there would be time later for whatever ceremony that recognition deserved. "There's a fourth condition," Marissa said. Leonard waited. She looked at him directly. "I need to know," she said, "that when I tell you something is a risk, when I put it in writing, and I put my name on it, and I tell you that something needs to be slowed down and examined, that it gets examined. Not forwarded and forgotten. Examined." Leonard was quiet for a moment. "That's not a structural condition," he said. "That's a personal one." "Yes," she said, "it is." He held her gaze. "You have my word," he said. She nodded once. She stood up. She straightened her jacket, the same deliberate, unhurried gesture she had made 4 days ago in the large conference room before she walked out, and she reached out and shook Leonard's hand across the round table. Then she went back to the operations center. She sat down. She looked at the claim counter. She looked at Sienna, who was running a verification report on the corrected payer entries, her eyes moving across the screen with a focus that had nothing performed about it anymore, just the genuine, stripped-down concentration of someone doing real work. Marissa opened a new document on her screen. At the top she typed, "Operations Documentation, Phase 1 Framework." She started writing. Outside the building, Atlanta was doing what Atlanta does at 3 in the morning quietly, existing in the dark. The downtown streets mostly empty, the rain from earlier in the week long gone, the air carrying the specific stillness of a city between one thing and the next. Inside on the 14th floor, the backlog counter reached 1,200 cleared claims, then 1,500. Then the threshold that meant Meridian's billing director would wake up in the morning to a processing report that showed recovery, not collapse. Marissa kept writing. She was building the thing that should have existed 12 years ago, the thing that would mean that the next Marissa Holloway, whoever she turned out to be, would not have to carry an entire system's operational memory, alone, in a handwritten journal that nobody bothered to formally preserve. She was building it now, in the middle of the night, in the company that had put her knowledge in a cardboard box and sent it home. She was building it anyway. Not because they deserved it, because the people who would use it did. And somewhere between the 2000th cleared claim and the documentation framework's third section, something shifted in Marissa Holloway, quiet and complete, the way structural things shift when the weight that's been pressing on them is finally precisely redistributed. She had spent 12 years being indispensable in a way that asked nothing of the organization and cost nothing from the organization, and required, from the organization, not a single act of recognition to sustain. She was not going to do that again. She kept writing, and the counter kept climbing, and the night kept moving toward whatever was waiting on the other side of it. And Marissa Holloway, VP of Client Systems and Operations, effective immediately. Conditions agreed upon. Word given did not stop until the work in front of her was done. The morning after the crisis broke open arrived the way mornings do when you haven't slept, not gradually, not with any of the soft transitional qualities that sleep normally provides, but as a hard, sudden fact. Light through the operations center windows, the ventilation system shifting from its nighttime hum to its daytime one, the sounds of the building waking up around them, floors above and below, the elevator chiming, the lobby filling, the ordinary machinery of a workday, beginning for people who had gone home at 5 the previous evening and slept 8 hours and arrived with coffee cups and had no idea what the 14th floor had looked like at 3 in the morning. Marissa had not gone home. She had considered it briefly around 4 a.m. when the backlog counter crossed the threshold she'd set as her internal benchmark for stability. She had looked at her phone, looked at the time, done the math on driving home, and returning for the 7 o'clock status call she'd already scheduled with Meridian's billing director, and decided the math didn't work. She had found the small couch in the break room, set an alarm for 6, and lay down in her clothes with her arm over her eyes. She slept for 1 hour and 40 minutes. When the alarm went off, she sat up immediately, which was how she always woke from short sleep, not gradually, not fighting it, just from off to on, the way a switch moves. She went to the bathroom. She ran cold water over her wrists for 30 seconds, which she'd read somewhere did something useful physiologically and had found, over years of long nights, to be true enough to keep doing. She looked at herself in the mirror. Her eyes had the particular flatness of sustained function under fatigue not vacant, just stripped of everything non-essential. She looked like someone who had been working and was going to keep working. She looked exactly like herself. She went back to the operations center. Sienna was still there. Marissa stopped in the doorway for a moment. Sienna was at Station 4, head tilted slightly to one side, reading something on her screen with the quality of attention that only survives into the 6th hour of overnight work if the person doing it has a real investment in what they're looking at. Her blazer was off again. Her hair had achieved a new level of disorder beyond what Marissa had observed at midnight. There was an empty coffee cup beside her keyboard, and another one that still had an inch of cold liquid in it that she hadn't touched in some time. Marcus was at his station too. He had managed at some point to acquire a breakfast from somewhere, and was eating it with the focused appreciation of a man for whom food had become purely functional. Marissa sat down. Status, she said. Marcus swallowed. Backlog is at 83% cleared. The corrected routing has held through 2 full subcycles since the patch. No new rejections, no new misroutes. Meridian's overnight report pulled and queued for your review. Billing director's assistant confirmed the 7 a.m. call. Dev's team signed off at 4:30. Left documentation for the bridge layer configuration. I've got it. He picked up a printed set of pages from beside his keyboard and held them out. She took them. She read through the documentation while the floor filled up around her, the regular morning staff arriving in 2s and 3s, the particular moment when people who had been in the office through the night and people arriving fresh first encountered each other, and the energy in the room became layered and slightly awkward, the way it always was when some people had experienced something that others had missed, and the gap between those two states was still raw. At 6:47, the elevator opened, and 3 people stepped out who were not regular operations staff. Marissa clocked them before she'd consciously identified them, the particular walk of people arriving with a specific purpose and a specific authority. Suits at 6:47 in the morning, which meant they'd dressed for this, which meant this had been planned before the night was over. One of them was Leonard. The second was a woman Marissa recognized as Aldercrest's general counsel, Patricia Hearn, a composed, silver-haired woman in her mid-50s, who Marissa had interacted with exactly 3 times in 12 years, and who moved through corporate environments with the practiced economy of someone who charged by the hour and intended each one to count. The third was a man Marissa didn't recognize. Mid-40s, substantial build, the careful neutral expression of someone trained to observe rather than react. He was carrying a leather portfolio. Leonard saw Marissa and came directly to the operations center. "How are we?" he said. 83% cleared, routing stable. 7 a.m. call with Meridian, and she checked the clock, 11 minutes. He nodded. "I'll be on that call. I know how to handle." "I know you do," he said. "I'm not there to handle it. I'm there to demonstrate executive presence to a client that's been given reasons to question whether this organization has any." He held her gaze. "You lead the call. I'm support." She looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded. Patricia Hearn had positioned herself near the edge of the operations center, taking in the room with the particular comprehensive attention of someone building a mental inventory. The unidentified man with the leather portfolio had stationed himself beside her. Marissa looked at Leonard. "Who is he?" "External consultant. Risk and liability. Patricia brought him in last night." A slight pause. "There are legal dimensions to the claims exposure we need to get ahead of." Marissa understood immediately what that meant, not just the legal exposure from the misrouted claims, but the potential liability question of whether the dismissed warning email constituted a documented failure of duty that a client could pursue. $12 million in potentially compromised claims was not a figure that stayed internal. It was a figure that moved into attorney territory, into regulatory territory, into the territory of formal accountability that corporations hired people specifically to navigate. "Does Gavin know?" she said. "Gavin has been advised to have personal counsel available," Leonard said. "Yes." The 7 a.m. call was conducted from the large conference room, the glass one, the one with the long table. Leonard sat at the head of it. Marissa sat to his immediate left with her laptop open and the overnight processing report and the patch documentation, and 3 pages of notes she'd written between 4 and 6 a.m. Sienna sat 2 seats down, present because Marissa had told her to be there, because this was part of what development looked like, and Sienna needed to see how a client call ran when everything that could go wrong had gone wrong, and you were the one on the other end of it, responsible for the explanation. The Meridian billing director was a man named Gerald Park. Marissa had dealt with him for 4 years. He was methodical and precise, and not unkind, but completely transactional in the particular way of people who have been burned by vendor relationships and developed their professional demeanor as a consequence. He got on the call at 7:02 and said good morning, and then immediately said, "Walk me through what happened." Marissa's walked him through it. She used plain language. She did not use any of the softening constructions that corporate communication training encourages. She did not say there were some processing challenges or some routing irregularities or some unexpected system behaviors. She said there was a software compatibility defect introduced during the October deployment. It was not caught during quality assurance. It has been causing claim misrouting since October 9th. We identified the root cause last night, deployed a corrective patch at 12:51 a.m., and the backlog has been clearing at a stable rate since 1:03. As of this morning, 83% of the stuck claims have been processed. The remaining 17% will clear in the next 6 hours. Gerald was quiet for a moment after she finished. October 9th, he said. Yes. We're in the 3rd week of the following month. Yes. I'm looking at an overnight report that shows a 17% backlog remaining from a single processing run. His voice was careful. What I don't have, Ms. Holloway, is any picture of what the last 6 months look like outside of this single incident. Here it was. Marissa had known this moment was coming. She had known it since she'd calculated the historical exposure estimate the night before. She had written and rewritten the sentence in her head a dozen times in the last 3 hours. We are conducting a full audit of claims processed since October 9th, she said. The preliminary estimate suggests there may be a broader pattern of misrouting across that period. We will have a complete picture within 2 weeks and will present it to you directly, with full documentation of affected claims and a remediation plan. The silence that followed was the specific silence of a man choosing his next words with exceptional care. How broad, he said. Leonard made the smallest possible gesture with his left hand, almost nothing, just a slight movement of the fingers, the kind of signal that passed between people who had agreed on a communication strategy. The preliminary estimate is in the range of $8 to $12 million in potentially affected claims, Marissa said. I want to be clear that this does not mean $12 million in losses. Many of these claims will be recoverable through the remediation process. But I am not going to give you a number that understates the scope. Another silence, longer. Who was responsible? Gerald said. The root cause was a failure to properly test a software update against existing system architecture, Marissa said. We are conducting an internal review of the decision-making process. I can tell you that the person who identified this risk in advance is the person speaking to you right now, and I am now in an executive role with final approval authority over all major system changes affecting client infrastructure. A pause. You identified it in advance, Gerald said, in writing. 6 months ago, the longest silence yet. I'm going to need a meeting, Gerald said, in person, this week. Me, our CFO, and the Aldercrest executive team. Thursday, Leonard said. It was the first word he'd spoken on the call. We'll come to you Thursday, Gerald said. 9 a.m., Ms. Holloway, yes. I want you in that room. I'll be there, she said. The call ended. The conference room was very quiet for a moment. Then Sienna said quietly, from 2 seats down, 8 to 12 million. Yes, Marissa said. He held it together. He's professional. Marissa closed her laptop. He'll fall apart with his own team this afternoon. That's why Thursday matters. By Thursday, they'll have had 48 hours to react. Internally, and they'll come in with a specific list of what they need from us to stay. Our job is to have already built what they're going to ask for. Sienna looked at her. How do we know what they're going to ask for? Because I know, Gerald, Marissa said, and because the list is the same list any reasonable client would have. Real-time claim monitoring dashboard. Weekly processing reports sent directly to their CFO. A dedicated escalation contact human not a ticketing system with a 4-hour response guarantee, and an independent audit of the remediation process, not conducted by anyone at Aldercrest. She stood up. "Start building the monitoring dashboard this morning," she said to Sienna. "I'll write the escalation protocol. We'll review together before Thursday." Sienna nodded. She was already reaching for her laptop. Marissa walked out of the conference room and back toward the operations center and stopped. Gavin Mercer was standing in the middle of the operations floor. He was wearing the same suit as the previous day, which meant he had either not gone home or had gone home and returned in the same clothes, and neither option suggested a peaceful night. He was standing with the particular posture of a man who has been thinking about something for several hours and has arrived at a position and is prepared to hold it regardless of what happens next. Patricia Hearn was 3 feet to his left. The external consultant was beside her. Leonard was coming out of the conference room behind Marissa. The floor had gone quiet the way it had gone quiet when Marissa first walked back in 2 days ago. That pressure change quiet crept in. Everything recalibrating. "I want to address the operational record," Gavin said. He was talking to Leonard. He was not looking at Marissa. "Gavin," Leonard said. His voice was not warm. "This isn't the time or place to—" "The email that's being used to characterize my decision-making was not the only data I had at the time," Gavin said. He was speaking clearly, and at a pace that suggested he had rehearsed this. "I received an assessment from IT leadership that contradicted Marissa's concerns. I made a decision based on competing expert opinions. That is not negligence. That is management. We can discuss this in a plan." "The email is being presented as though it was the only relevant input," Gavin continued, louder. "It wasn't. I consulted the VP of it. I consulted the vendor. Both told me the risk was manageable. I made a judgment call. The fact that the judgment was wrong does not retroactively make the process." "Gavin." Leonard's voice had acquired a quality. Not loud. Just final. Stop. But Gavin's eyes had moved to Marissa now. "You want everyone to believe this was simple," he said to her directly. "You want everyone to believe you were right, and I was wrong, and that's the whole story. But you don't run a department of 40 people. You don't manage competing priorities and timeline pressures, and executive expectations, and vendor relationships, and client demands simultaneously. You sit in your lane, and you master it, and you find the problems in other people's thinking, and you've been doing that for 12 years, and somehow you've convinced yourself that makes you a leader." The floor was completely silent. Marissa looked at him. She didn't answer immediately. She let the silence stay. Not as a tactic she was actually thinking, actually deciding, and the deciding took the time it took. "You're right," she said. Gavin blinked. "I sat in my lane," she said. "I found the problems. I documented them. I sent them up the chain with my name on them. And then I watched the problems I documented get ignored and the decisions get made anyway." She kept her voice even. "I don't think that makes me a leader, Gavin. I think it makes me someone who did her job thoroughly in an environment that wasn't set up to use what she knew. The question isn't whether I could manage 40 people. The question is whether you were managing them well with the information you had in the way they deserved." She paused, and the answer to that question is in the processing log. He looked at her. His jaw was working slightly, the way jaws do when the thing a person wants to say is fighting with the thing they know they shouldn't. Patricia Hearn moved slightly, just a repositioning, but it was the repositioning of someone placing themselves strategically. "Gavin," she said. Her voice was quiet and precise. "I need you to come with me. We need to have a conversation in private before this goes further." He looked at Patricia. He looked at Leonard. He looked back at Marissa. And in his expression was something complicated, something that wasn't quite anger anymore, and wasn't quite defeat, and wasn't quite anything she could name cleanly, because it was probably several things at once. The way the expressions of people who have finally run out of positions are several things at once. He turned and followed Patricia toward the small conference room. The external consultant went with them. The door closed. Leonard stood beside Marissa. They both looked at the closed door for a moment. "That conversation is going to take a while," Leonard said. "I know," Marissa said. "When it's done, you'll have the operational authority we discussed, formally documented. HR is processing the offer letter this morning." She nodded. She was watching the closed door. "Marissa." He waited until she looked at him. "I want to say something that isn't about the contract, or the client, or the technical situation." She waited. "What happened to you 4 days ago shouldn't have happened, he said. Not the way it happened. Not with 12 years of what you've demonstrated in this building. He held her gaze. I'm not going to pretend I had nothing to do with the culture that allowed it to happen. I did, signing off on departmental restructures. Without asking harder questions, that's on me. I should have asked harder questions. Marissa looked at him for a long moment. You're asking them now, she said. He accepted that the partial credit of it, the measured nature of it, the fact that she was not providing absolution, and he hadn't really expected her to. Yes, he said, I am. He left her to the floor. The morning moved through itself the way high-pressure mornings do, no wasted minutes, no slack, everything with a purpose and a deadline attached. The backlog cleared 91% by 9 a.m. Sienna had the monitoring dashboard framework, built by 1030, rough but structurally sound, and came to Marissa's station with her laptop and a specific uncertainty about whether the real-time refresh interval was set correctly, and Marissa looked at it and said set it to 90 seconds, not 5 minutes, because Gerald's CFO was going to want to be able to pull it up and see current data, not data that was 5 minutes old, and therefore telling them what had already happened rather than what was happening. Sienna went and set it to 90 seconds. At 11:14, the backlog cleared completely. Marcus said, that's it, and leaned back in his chair and stretched his arms over his head and made a sound that was more physiological release than celebration. Marissa looked at the screen. All claims processed. Routing stable. 0 pending exceptions. She had been awake for approximately 29 hours with a 90-minute interruption on a break room couch. She was aware of this, the way you're aware of a weight you've been carrying long enough that you've stopped noticing it separately from yourself. It was just part of the condition of existing at that moment, integrated and managed. Go home, she said to Marcus. He looked at her. You're not going. I have a meeting at 2, then go home after. Probably, she said, which meant no, and he knew it. And he went home anyway because he had been there longer than she had and had less of a stake in being present for what came next. What came next was the 2 o'clock meeting, which she had called with the operation senior staff, the 6 team leads who ran the day-to-day processing functions, the people who were not executives and not junior analysts, but the middle layer of the operation, the people who actually knew where every process lived and how every system behaved, and who had been running their functions for years, under structures that had never formally asked them what they knew. She had sent the meeting invitation at 6 a.m. She had not told them what it was about beyond. Operational review structural. All team leads required. They came in at 2 o'clock and sat around the large conference table and looked at her with expressions that ranged from cautious to wary to something close to hostile, particularly from a man named Roy Callahan, who had run the claims verification team for 7 years and had applied for a management role twice and been passed over both times and had developed, through this process, a particular relationship with authority figures that was not warm. Marissa stood at the head of the table. She did not have a presentation. She had 4 pages of handwritten notes from the morning and a legal pad and a pen. I want to know what you know, she said, all of you, about how this operation actually runs. Not the documented version, the real version. Roy crossed his arms. Why? Because the documented version was wrong enough that we lost 6 months of correct processing and $2.3 million in a single backlog incident. She looked at him directly, and I know there are things in this operation that aren't documented. Things that live in people's heads and get handed down in hallway conversations because nobody ever built a system to capture them. I want to know what those things are. A silence around the table. We've had these conversations before, Roy said. Every time someone new comes in and wants to fix the documentation problem, we have the conversation. We write some things down, and then 6 months later, the written down things are out of date because nobody maintains them, and we're back to hallway conversations. Yes, Marissa said. That's what's happened. He looked at her. He was clearly prepared for more pushback and was recalibrating slightly. I wrote the same things down for 12 years, she said, in a personal journal, because there was no system worth writing them into. I'm not here to tell you that was your failure. I'm here to tell you I'm building the system, and I need to know what goes in it. Another silence, a different quality to this one. A woman named Sandra Pierce, who ran insurance verification and had been doing it for 9 years, and was one of the most competent people in the building in a way that had never been formally recognized, said, "There are 3 payer codes in the current table that everyone in my team knows are flagged wrong, but we've been manually correcting for 2 years because submitting a formal change request takes 6 weeks and nobody's approved the last 3 we sent." "Write them down," Marissa said. She slid the legal pad down the table. "Right now." "All 3. Sandra wrote them down. "Who else?" Marissa said. Roy uncrossed his arms. He reached for the legal pad. The meeting ran for 2 hours and 40 minutes and produced 11 pages of notes and the beginning of something that was not yet a system, but was the specific kind of raw material. That systems are built from actual institutional knowledge, drawn out of the people who held it and placed somewhere where it could be used. When it was done and the team leads were filing out, Roy stopped at the door. "The monitoring dashboard," he said. "Who's building it?" "Sienna. Working off a framework I designed this morning." Roy was quiet for a moment. "Sienna's smart," he said. It didn't sound like a compliment exactly. It sounded like an assessment, someone who has been measuring delivered by someone who has been measuring something for a while and is prepared to report the measurement on its high regardless of how they feel about it. "She doesn't know what she doesn't know yet. That's what training is for," Marissa said. He looked at her. "You're not going to freeze her out." "No." "Even after," he stopped. "Even after," she said. He nodded once. He left. Marissa sat down at the conference table with the 11 pages of notes. She was running on something that was not quite adrenaline anymore. Adrenaline had a ceiling, and she'd long since passed it, but something more structural. The particular fuel of a person who has a specific and important thing to do and has committed to doing it. Her phone rang. The number was Kira's school. She picked up immediately. "Ms. Holloway? This is the front office at. Is she okay?" "She's fine. She asked us to call. She said you weren't answering texts." Marissa looked at her phone. 4 texts from Kira. She had not seen them. "Tell her I'll call in 5 minutes," Marissa said. She called in 4. Kira picked up on the first ring. "Mom, it's almost 5 o'clock. "I know. Did you go home at all?" "I'll go home tonight." "You keep saying Kira." She pressed the phone harder against her ear. "I will come home tonight. I promise. I need 2 more hours." A pause. The specific pause of a 17-year-old who has heard versions of this sentence before and is doing the math on how much she believes it. "Are you okay?" Kira asked. Marissa looked at the 11 pages of notes, at the large conference table, at the operations center through the glass wall, Sienna at Station 4, the monitoring dashboard framework on her screen, the numbers all stable, all clean, the crisis resolved, and the aftermath work begun. "Yeah," she said. "I think I actually am. Don't forget to eat something." "I won't." She had in fact forgotten to eat something. She went to the break room and found a granola bar in the back of a cabinet and ate it standing up, which was not dinner, but was a biological acknowledgement that she still existed in a body which felt important to register. She was throwing away the wrapper when Sienna appeared in the doorway. "The dashboard is done," Sienna said. "First version. It needs review. Show me." They went to Station 4. Marissa looked at the dashboard. It was clean and functional and structurally correct and had 2 problems. The threshold for claim rejection rates was set too conservatively, which would generate false positives, and the payer category breakdown was using the wrong grouping logic, which would make the date misleading to Gerald's CFO. She told Sienna both things, specifically, with the explanation attached. Sienna fixed them, both in under 12 minutes. "Now run it against last night's data," Marissa said. "I want to see what it would have shown if we'd had it running during the backlog incident." Sienna ran it. The dashboard populated with the previous night's data and showed, clearly and immediately, the moment the backlog began compounding a spike in the claim processing delay metric at 11:42 p.m. that would have been visible and alarmable if the dashboard had existed. They both looked at it. 4 hours earlier, Sienna said. "We would have caught it 4 hours earlier with this running." Would that have been enough time? It would have been enough time to call dev before midnight instead of after, which means the patch deploys at 10 p.m. instead of 12:50, which means the 1:15 cycle runs clean, and Meridian never has a reason to make the call to their CEO. Sienna stared at the screen, at the spike, at the clear, unambiguous visual evidence of something that could have been seen if the right tool had existed. "I'm going to build a second version," she said, with a predictive alert layer. Something that flags the trajectory before the threshold is hit. not after. Marissa looked at her, not with surprise, with something more like the particular attention you give to a thing that is developing into what it was supposed to be. That, Marissa said, is the right idea. I'll need Marcus for the algorithm side. Marcus is home sleeping. Call him tomorrow. Sienna nodded. She was already opening a new document. At 6:15, Patricia Hearn knocked on the frame of the operations center entrance. Marissa looked up. Do you have a few minutes? Patricia said. They went to the small conference room, the round table room. Sienna's diagram still on the whiteboard. Patricia sat down. The external consultant was with her again, leather portfolio open this time, a legal pad visible inside it. I want to brief you on where things stand with Gavin, Patricia said. Marissa waited. He's been placed on administrative leave, effective this afternoon, Patricia said, with full pay and benefits while we conduct the formal review. His operational access has been revoked. The terms of his separation will be negotiated over the next several weeks. What about the email, Marissa said? The decision record. The email and the documented decision chain are part of the formal review. The liability consultant, she indicated the man with the leather portfolio, is assessing what our exposure looks like from a client claims perspective and whether Gavin's decision creates any personal liability beyond his employment situation. And Meridian's legal team has been notified that we're conducting a formal review and that we'll have preliminary findings for Thursday's meeting. Patricia looked at her directly. They're going to ask on Thursday whether this creates a breach of contract situation. I want you to be prepared for that. I've been prepared for that since 2 a.m., Marissa said. Patricia almost smiled. It was a very small almost. I want to go over the technical record with you. Specifically the timeline of the warning email and the deployment decision. The details matter. I know the details. I know you do. I need them in a specific format. She slid a document across the table. This is what we need from you. A technical declaration, your assessment of the system fault, the timeline of your warning, and the current remediation status. Written in your voice but reviewed by us before Thursday. Marissa picked up the document. She read the first page. The second. This asks me to characterize Gavin's decision as negligent, she said. It asks you to characterize the decision-making process, Patricia said carefully. The characterization follows from the facts. If I write this document, Marissa said, and it becomes part of a legal proceeding, that is a possibility, yes. Then I'm testifying against someone I worked with for 12 years. The room was quiet. You're documenting what happened, Patricia said. You're providing a technical record of a decision and its consequences. What Gavin did with the information you gave him, that's on him. Marissa looked at the document. She thought about the 4-line reply. She thought about the cardboard box. She thought about the laugh through the glass wall. She thought about Roy Callahan uncrossing his arms and reaching for the legal pad. She thought about Kira asking if she was okay. She thought about Delphine Carroll saying, I have been waiting for you to become available. She thought about Gerald Park saying, I want you in that room. She thought about what it meant to hold the pen. She had spent 12 years handing information to people who decided what to do with it. She had built her career on being the person who knew things, and gave that knowledge to the structure above her in good faith and trusted that the structure would use it correctly. The structure had not used it correctly, and now the structure was handing her a pen and asking her to document that failure in terms that would have legal weight and professional consequence and ripple effects she could not fully map from where she was sitting. She had every right to write it. She had every reason to write it. The facts were not in dispute. The email existed. The reply existed. The system fault existed. The $2.3 million backlog existed. And the $8 to $12 million historical exposure existed. And the 6 months of silent processing errors existed. And all of it traced back to a decision that her warning had tried to prevent. She picked up the pen Patricia had placed on the table. I'll review it tonight, she said. I'll have it back to you by tomorrow morning. Thank you, Patricia said. Marissa walked back to the operations center. It was 6:47. The floor was quieter now. The daytime staff cycling toward end of day, the particular energy of the late afternoon, when the urgency of the morning has either resolved or become chronic. The claim counter showed complete. The routing monitor showed stable. The dashboard Sienna had built showed green across every metric. Marissa sat down at her station. She opened the documentation framework document she'd started at 3 in the morning. She looked at it for a moment. Then she opened Patricia's document beside it. 2 documents. One building something. One accounting for something that had already broken. Both necessary. Both hers to write. She put her hands on the keyboard. And then her phone rang again. And the number that appeared on the screen was not Kira's school, and not Gavin's office line, and not Dev Anand's direct number. It was Robert, the procurement director from the 4-hospital network, who had called her back within 90 minutes after she'd been fired, Humundstud, who had asked when they could meet, who had not yet been told that Marissa Holloway was no longer available because she had just accepted an executive role at the company that had put her in a cardboard box. She looked at the phone. She thought about Delphine Carroll's office, the real coffee smell, the row house in Midtown, the conversation that had felt like a negotiation between equals. She thought about the signed contract in her bag. The offer letter HR was processing, the VP title, the operational authority, the 4 conditions agreed to. She thought about what it would mean to take that call. She let it ring once more. Then she picked it up. "Robert," she said. "Marissa." His voice was warm and direct, in the way of someone who had known for a long time what they wanted and was accustomed to pursuing it without unnecessary ceremony. "I heard a rumor that you may have landed somewhere already." "Where did you hear that, Carlos?" "The vendor rep. He mentioned you were back at Aldercrest in a different capacity." "I'm in an executive capacity, yes," she said. "VP of Client Systems. Effective this week." A pause, a fast turnaround. The situation moved quickly. "Does that mean you're not available?" She looked at the operations center. At Sienna, building a predictive alert layer. At the monitoring dashboard running clean. At the 11 pages of notes from the team lead's meeting. At Patricia's document waiting to be written. "It means I'm not available the way you're thinking," she said. "But I'd like to have the conversation anyway. On my timeline." Robert was quiet for a moment. "Then name it. Next week. Thursday after 5. She picked up a pen and wrote Thursday on the corner of her legal pad. "There are things worth discussing regardless of where I land." "I'll make it work," he said. She ended the call. She looked at Thursday on her legal pad. She circled it. She put her pen down. She looked up at the clock on the operations center wall. 6:58 p.m. 31 hours since she'd walked through the lobby with her laptop bag. 90 minutes of sleep on a break room couch. 1 granola bar. She had 2 documents to write. A client meeting to lead on Thursday morning. A monitoring dashboard to review. 11 pages of operational knowledge to begin converting into formal documentation. A VP role to formally begin. She had by any reasonable measure done enough for one day. She did not go home. She opened Patricia's document. She started writing. The words came with the particular fluency of someone who knows exactly what they need to say and has spent years saying things carefully and has now, finally, been given a context in which careful and true are the same direction. She wrote for 40 minutes without stopping. When she reached the section about the email, the warning, the timestamp, the specific technical recommendation, the 4-line reply that dismissed it, she did not hesitate, and she did not soften it, and she did not editorialize. She documented it exactly as it had happened, with her name on it. Again, this time she was certain the right people would read it. Outside the building, Atlanta moved through its evening restaurants filling, the highway thickening and thinning, the skyline doing what skylines do in the dark, holding their lights up against it. Inside on the 14th floor, the operations center hummed its steady operational hum, stable and recovered and beginning, in the specific unglamorous way that systems begin things, to be rebuilt into something that would not fail the same way again. And at the head of it, Marissa Holloway sat writing, her face lit by the screen, her hand steady, the pen moving across Patricia's document with the weight of 12 years and the clarity of someone who has finally stopped waiting for the institution to tell her what she was worth and has decided, permanently and without ceremony, to know it herself. She reached the last section of the document. She read the question it asked. She took one breath, and she wrote the answer, and it was the truest thing she had put on paper in a very long time. And when she finished writing it, she sat back and read it once, and did not change a single word. She saved the document. She closed it. She opened the documentation framework. She kept working. She finished the documentation framework at 9:47 p.m. Not the complete version that would take weeks, built properly, with input from every team lead and cross-referenced against every system log and vendor record she could access. But the skeleton of it, the architecture, the thing that told you what needed to be captured, and how and by whom and on what schedule, so that the knowledge didn't live in one person's journal, under one person's desk, and disappear the moment that person carried a cardboard box to an elevator. She saved it. She closed the laptop. She sat for a moment in the quiet of the operations center, which was down to 2 junior analysts on overnight monitoring duty, both of them young enough that they'd been visibly uncertain whether to speak to her or not during the hours she'd been working beside them. She had made it easier by not requiring anything from them, just occupying the space and doing her work, which was its own kind of signal. She put on her jacket. She picked up her bag. She stopped at the exit. "If anything flags on the routing monitor tonight," she said to the closer of the 2 analysts, a young woman whose name tag said, "Priya, call me directly." Not the overnight manager. Me. Priya looked at her with the specific alert attention of someone young enough that being addressed directly by a VP still recalibrated their entire posture. "Yes, ma'am." Marissa had a brief internal reaction to the ma'am, which she did not express. She left. The parking garage was nearly empty. Her footsteps sounded different in an empty garage, more definite, more present, each one returning to her like a confirmation. She sat in her car, and she did not grip the steering wheel the way she had 11 days ago in this same garage after the termination. She just sat. She let the quiet be quiet. She was too tired for the kind of thinking that required effort and too awake for sleep, and so she existed in the specific in-between of someone who has expended everything and is waiting for the tank to begin refilling. She drove home. Kira was awake, of course she was. She was sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop and 3 textbooks arranged around her in the specific arrangement of a student who has been homework but has also been listening for the sound of a key in the door. And when Marissa came in, Kira looked up, and the expression on her face was the one Marissa had been carrying in her chest since 4 days ago, the one she hadn't let herself fully feel, because feeling it would have required stopping, and she hadn't been able to stop. Kira stood up. She didn't say anything. She just walked to her mother and put her arms around her. Marissa stood in the doorway of her own kitchen at 10:15 in the evening and held her daughter, who was 17 and 5'7", and somehow still fit against her shoulder, the same way she had at 7 years old, and she felt the 31 hours of the previous day, and the 4 days before that, and the 12 years before those settle into her. All at once, the full cumulative weight of it, present and accounted for. She didn't cry. She was too tired to cry, and too held together, and too aware that if she started, she wasn't certain where it would stop. Instead, she held on for a long moment, and then she stepped back and looked at her daughter's face and said, "Have you eaten?" "I made pasta," Kira said. "There's some left." "That sounds like the best thing I've heard in 2 days." She sat at the kitchen table and ate cold pasta, and Kira sat across from her, and they talked not about Aldercrest, not about Gavin or Leonard or the processing logs or the $12 million exposure. Kira talked about her college essay, the second draft she'd been working on, the sentence she'd rewritten 9 times, and still wasn't sure about. Marissa listened. She asked questions. She ate pasta. It was the most normal 20 minutes she'd had in a week. When she went to bed, she slept for 7 hours straight, which was not something she'd done in longer than she could immediately remember. And when she woke up, the sun was fully in the room, and her phone showed 2 missed calls from numbers she recognized as Aldercrest internal lines, and 1 text from Marcus that said, simply, "All clear overnight. Routing held." She texted back, "Good. Take the morning." She showered. She dressed in something that was not the charcoal blazer. She made coffee and stood at the kitchen window and drank it and watched the street outside, ordinary and indifferent. People moving through their mornings. The neighbor's dog sitting at the edge of the yard with the philosophical patience of an animal that has no concept of organizational collapse or executive titles or the particular weight of a termination letters sliding across a conference table. She went in. The Thursday meeting with Meridian was at 9 a.m. in their regional offices, a 40-minute drive from Aldercrest through the kind of Atlanta traffic that tests the relationship between ambition and patience. Leonard drove. Patricia sat in the front. Marissa sat in the back with her laptop bag on her lap and the documentation folder and a printed copy of the monitoring dashboard framework and the first completed section of the operational documentation she'd been building since Tuesday night. She had also brought, though she had told no one she was bringing it, the technical declaration Patricia had asked her to write. She had finalized it at 6 a.m. that morning, read it twice, and printed 2 copies. One was in the documentation folder. The other was in the inside pocket of her jacket, which was not the charcoal blazer. Gerald Park's conference room was not the kind of room designed to make guests comfortable. It was large and efficient, and the table was long, and Gerald sat at the center of his side of it with his CFO, a compact, precise woman named Dr. Angela Bzuf, who had the particular energy of someone who has spent a career in financial accountability and considers ambiguity a personal affront, and their general counsel, and 2 other people Marissa placed as risk and compliance. They sat down across from each other. Gerald said, "Good morning." Leonard said, "Good morning." Gerald said, "Let's begin." Leonard began. He spoke for 4 minutes, the executive framing, the acknowledgement, the broad outline of what had occurred and what was being done. He used the word accountability twice, and he meant it both times, which was not nothing, but it was also not the thing that mattered most in that room. Gerald listened. Dr. Rhodes took notes. Nobody on their side of the table changed expression. When Leonard finished, Gerald looked at Marissa. "Walk me through it," he said. She walked him through it. She used the same plain language she'd used on the phone Monday morning. She used the monitoring dashboard documentation, which she slid across the table to Dr. Rhodes. At the precise moment, she described the real-time visibility tools that would now govern Aldercrest's management of Meridian's claims processing. She used the operational documentation framework, which she described in specific enough terms that the Meridian legal counsel began writing faster. She used the timeline, October 9th, the deployment, the reconciliation batch, the silent failure, the 6 months of compounding misroutes, and she used the email. She did not read it aloud. She slid a printed copy across the table. She said, "This is a warning I provided to Aldercrest management 6 months before this incident. It identifies the specific system risk that caused the failure. It recommended the specific remediation step, a stress test of the routing module that would have prevented it. The recommendation was not acted on." Dr. Rhodes looked at the email. She read it. She looked at the 4-line reply below it. She set the page down. She looked at Marissa. "You work for Aldercrest," she said. "I do. And you're showing us documentation that demonstrates your company ignored a warning that could have prevented this incident." "Yes," Marissa said. "Why?" Marissa looked at her directly. "Because you need to know the full truth of what happened to decide whether you can trust us going forward. And because the only basis on which you should make that decision is accurate information." She paused. "If I give you a version of this that minimizes what went wrong, you make your decision based on incomplete data. And you've had 6 months of incomplete data. That ends today." The room was quiet. Gerald looked at Leonard. "Did you know she was going to do this?" "I knew she would tell you the truth," Leonard said. "I didn't ask her what form it would take." Gerald looked at the email again, then at Marissa, then at the monitoring dashboard documentation. "The person who sent this warning," he said, "is now in charge of preventing it from happening again." "Yes," Marissa said. He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Dr. Rhodes set her pen down. "Angela," he said. Dr. Rhodes looked at him. "The remediation terms," he said. "Walk them through it." What followed was 90 minutes of detailed negotiation, not hostile, not warm, entirely professional, and entirely serious, the kind of conversation that costs people significant money to have and produces documents that attorneys bill hourly rates to produce and review. Dr. Rhodes was precise and uncompromising and fair. Patricia was precise and strategic. Marissa contributed when the technical record needed to be established, or when a proposed term had operational implications that the legal teams on both sides hadn't yet mapped. The terms that emerged were not comfortable for Aldercrest. A formal audit of all claims processed since October 9th, conducted by an independent third party to be agreed upon jointly. A remediation fund established for unrecoverable misrouted payments. The real-time monitoring dashboard, implemented within 30 days. Quarterly in-person operational reviews with Marissa present. a right of audit clause giving Meridian's team access to processing logs on 48 hours notice, and a contract extension, 3 years, with a renegotiated rate that reflected the expanded monitoring and accountability infrastructure. They didn't terminate, they stayed. But they stayed in a fundamentally different arrangement than the one that had allowed 6 months of silent failure to compound without consequence. And everyone in that room understood that the difference was the woman sitting across the table who had handed them the worst evidence against her own employer and said, "This is what you need to know." When they walked out of the Meridian building into the Atlanta morning, Leonard stood on the sidewalk for a moment and looked at the sky with the expression of someone taking inventory of the distance between where they were standing and where they'd been standing 72 hours ago. "That was either the bravest thing I've ever seen in a client meeting," he said, "or the most reckless." "It was neither," Marissa said. "It was the only thing that was going to work." He looked at her. "How did you know they wouldn't terminate on the spot?" "Because Gerald is a professional who has been managing vendor relationships for 20 years, she said. "And because the one thing a professional with 20 years of vendor experience wants more than to terminate a bad relationship is to know that the bad relationship is fixable." She picked up her bag. "I gave him proof it was fixable. The email was part of that proof. It showed him the problem wasn't systemic incompetence. It was a specific failure of a specific decision-making process that no longer exists." Leonard was quiet for a moment. "Gavin's going to see the audit findings," he said. "His attorneys are going to see them. This creates exposure for him personally." "I know," Marissa said. "And you did it anyway." She looked at him. "The exposure comes from what he did, Leonard, not from me documenting it." He nodded slowly. Patricia was already on her phone, walking toward the car. The external consultant was typing something on his laptop in the back seat. Marissa stood on the sidewalk for a moment more. She thought about Gavin. She had been thinking about Gavin in controlled, manageable amounts since the conference room confrontation, not with anger anymore, which surprised her, but with something more complicated. Gavin was not a monster. She had worked alongside him for 12 years, and she knew what he was, which was a man of ordinary capacity who had been promoted to a level where his limitations became consequential, and who had made, over years, a series of small decisions to protect his position rather than serve the organization. And those small decisions had accumulated into something much larger than he'd intended, or probably understood. That didn't make what he'd done forgivable. It made it human, which was in some ways worse. She got in the car. The week that followed was the hardest kind of hard, not the dramatic crisis-driven hard of the Tuesday night backlog, but the sustained, unglamorous hard of rebuilding. Staff meetings that ran long because the questions being asked had never been asked before, and the answers required excavating years of undocumented practice. System documentation sessions with Roy Callahan and Sandra Pierce and the other team leads that produced pages of optional knowledge that had existed only in people's heads and memories and personal notebooks until someone finally asked for it and created a place to put it. Sienna's predictive alert dashboard. The second version, with the trajectory-based flagging system, she and Marcus had built over 3 days, running parallel to the main monitoring dashboard, flagging anomalies before they crossed critical thresholds. Marissa reviewed it on a Friday afternoon and sat with it for a long time, and then said, "Submit it for the Meridian integration. It goes live in their 30-day package." Sienna looked at her. "Are you sure it's ready?" "It's better than anything we had before. Ready is relative." She looked at the dashboard. "Put your name on the documentation. Your name clearly, as lead developer." Sienna was quiet for a moment. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "No," Marissa agreed. "I didn't." The formal review of Gavin's decision record concluded in the 4th week. The findings were documented, reviewed by both legal teams, and resulted in a negotiated separation agreement that was not disclosed in its specifics, but whose general contours were understood by everyone who worked in the building. Gavin was gone. The terms were settled. The chapter was closed in the specific way organizational chapters without ceremony and with significant paperwork. Marissa was not in the room when the final terms were signed. She had asked not to be. She was in the operations center, reviewing the first monthly processing report under the new monitoring framework, which showed exactly nothing alarming: clean routing, clean claims, the system doing what it was built to do, operating under conditions that now required it to be legible rather than opaque. She printed the report. She initialed it. She put it in the new documentation folder that sat on the corner of her desk where the cardboard box had once lived under it. The Delphine Carroll meeting happened on a Tuesday evening in the 5th week at the same Midtown row house with the same real coffee smell. Marissa arrived and sat across from Delphine and said, before anything else, "I'm not leaving Aldercrest." Delphine looked at her. "I know," she said. "I figured that out the morning you left here to take a phone call and didn't come back." A slight smile. "I'm not offended. I want to talk about something else," Marissa said. "I assumed you did." What they talked about was a consulting partnership, not Marissa leaving Aldercrest, but a structured arrangement in which Delphine's firm and Aldercrest's operations team collaborated on specific healthcare billing infrastructure projects for clients they shared or could share. Marissa had spent 2 weeks building the business case for it. She had brought it to Leonard first, received conditional approval, and brought it to Delphine second. Delphine read the business case. She set it down. "You built this in 5 weeks," she said, "whilst you were stabilizing a crisis and building a documentation system and leading a client retention meeting and taking on an executive role. The nights are long," Marissa said. Delphine looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not quite admiration, more like the recognition one capable person extends to another when they encounter work that reflects a specific and rare quality of mind. "You could have built this for yourself," she said. "Independent, your own firm. You have the clients. You have the reputation. You have the knowledge." A pause. "Why Aldercrest?" Marissa looked at the business case document on the table. "Because there are 200 people in that building whose livelihoods depend on whether the organization they work for functions correctly," she said, "and I know how to make it function correctly. And walking away from it to build something for myself while it continues to not function correctly is a choice I could make but I don't want to live with." Delphine was quiet for a moment. "That's either very generous," she said, "or very foolish." "My mother says it's both." Delphine laughed. It was a real laugh, short and genuine. "Send me the contract terms," she said. "I'll have my attorney review by end of week." They shook hands. Marissa drove home in the specific quiet of a city evening, the radio off. The windows cracked enough that the Atlanta air came through with its particular quality warm still. Even this late in the season, the kind of warmth that doesn't apologize for itself. She thought about Robert's meeting, which had happened the previous Thursday, and had produced not a job offer, but the beginning of an ongoing conversation about a regional hospital network project that Aldercrest was now positioned to bid on, with Marissa as the architect of the technical proposal. She had told Leonard about the meeting before it happened. He had said, "Good, keep the relationship warm." She thought about that. The difference between the organization that had handed her a cardboard box and the one she was now helping to build. The difference was not complete organizations, didn't transform completely. They shifted incrementally. Old habits persisting in corners, old hierarchies finding new expressions, but the shift was real enough to work within, real enough to be worth staying for. If you were the kind of person who believed that staying and changing something was more valuable than leaving and starting over, she was, it turned out, that kind of person. She had spent 12 years not knowing it, because the conditions for knowing it hadn't existed. She turned onto her street. The light in Kira's room was on. The kitchen light was on. The ordinary illuminated rectangle of her apartment in the dark of the building, specific and identifiable from the street below. She sat in the parking spot for a moment. She thought about the night she'd sat in the parking garage for 11 minutes and held the steering wheel and looked at the concrete pillar and thought about 12 years. She thought about the laptop she'd opened at her kitchen table, the resume she'd rewritten, the emails she'd sent in the morning dark. She thought about the laugh through the glass wall. She would probably never know whose laugh it was. She had, over the preceding weeks, looked at faces in the operations center and tried to know, and she could not identify it with certainty. And she had reached the point where she understood that identifying it wouldn't change anything that mattered. The laugh was a symptom. She had treated the disease. The symptom was irrelevant now. She got out of the car. She went upstairs. Kira was at the kitchen table.
The college essay was
printed sitting in front of her, covered in her own handwriting in the margins. She looked up when Marissa came in. The sentence, Kira said. The one I've been rewriting. Which version? The 9th one. Kira slid the paper across the table. Marissa sat down. She read the sentence. She read it again. That's it, she said. Kira looked at her. You're sure? That's the sentence, Marissa said. Stop rewriting it. Kira exhaled a long, involuntary exhale, the sound of something that has been held tightly being released. She picked up the paper. She read the sentence herself. She nodded slowly. Okay, Marissa said. She went to the cabinet and got a glass, and filled it with water, and stood at the sink and drank it, looking at the kitchen window, which was dark with the night behind it and reflected the interior of the room. Back at her. The table. The books. Kira gathering her papers. The refrigerator with its collection of magnets accumulated over years. The small cactus on the windowsill that was the replacement of the original cactus and had, in the 6 weeks since she'd brought it home, grown noticeably toward the light. She looked at the cactus for a moment. She thought about the handwritten journal, which was sitting on her desk at Aldercrest in the top drawer, intact. She had not been asked to surrender it. She had not offered it. It was hers 12 years of accumulated operational knowledge in her handwriting, her abbreviations, her shorthand, and it would stay hers. The knowledge it contained was being translated, carefully and systematically, into the formal documentation system she was building. But the journal itself was not the documentation system. It was something else. It was the record of a person doing her job for a long time in conditions that didn't always recognize it, and that record belonged to her and not to the institution that had benefited from it. She put her glass in the sink. She sat back down at the table. The other thing, Kira said, not looking up from her paper, the interview. For the Morehouse program. She hesitated. It's the same week as the Meridian audit kickoff. Since Moose. Marissa had known this. She had known it since she'd looked at the calendar 3 days ago and identified the overlap and set it aside to think about, and had not in 3 days thought about it. She thought about it now. What time is the interview? She said. 2 o'clock. The audit kickoff is the morning, Marissa said. 9 to noon, Kira looked up. You can do both. The kickoff is in person. The afternoon sessions are review work I can delegate. She held Kira's gaze. I can do both. Kira looked at her for a moment with an expression that was several years of something compressed into a single look. All the evenings Marissa had stared at her phone during dinner. All the events attended with half her attention elsewhere. All the times the default answer had been, I'll try, and the actual answer had been, I can't quite make it. Okay, Kira said. Careful, I'll be there, Marissa said. At 2, Kira held the look for one more moment. Then she went back to her essay. Marissa opened her laptop. She had 4 emails to respond to, and a framework section to complete, and a draft of the Delphine Carroll partnership proposal to review before morning. She had a full day tomorrow, and a fuller one on Thursday, and the week after that was already filling with the particular density of a person who has moved from surviving a crisis to building something from its wreckage. She started with the framework section. She wrote for 40 minutes. When she stopped, she read what she'd written and found that it said what she meant it to say, which was not always guaranteed and was worth noting when it happened. She sent the email to Roy Callahan about the verification team documentation session scheduled for Monday. She sent the email to Patricia about the audit coordination timeline. She started the email to Delphine's attorney about the partnership contract terms. Kira fell asleep at the table somewhere around midnight, her head tilted to the side, the essay draft still in front of her. Marissa got up and put a hand on her shoulder, and Kira came awake, with the immediate, slightly confused alertness of a teenager who has not yet learned to sleep in any other way. Go to bed, Marissa said. Kira gathered her papers with the slow movements of someone operating at 30% capacity. She stopped in the hallway. Mom. Are you actually okay? Not the answer you give other people. Marissa looked at her daughter in the hallway, the printed essay in her arms. The question asked with the directness of someone who has watched someone else carefully for a long time and has learned to tell the difference between performance and fact. She thought about what actually okay meant. She thought about the termination letter and the cardboard box and the parking garage and the email with the 4-line reply and the $2.3 million and Gerald Park's conference room and the document she'd written in plain language, with her name on it and Gavin standing in the doorway at 3 in the morning and Leonard saying, You have my word. She thought about the cactus on the windowsill, growing toward the light, slowly, without being asked. Yeah, she said. Not the answer I give other people. Kira looked at her for one more moment. Then she went to bed. Marissa sat alone at the kitchen table. The apartment was quiet around her, the particular quiet of a place that holds people who are sleeping, warmer than empty quiet, weighted with presence. She put both palms flat on the table the way she had 6 weeks ago, when Delphine's email had arrived, and she'd read it 3 times and felt the ground shifting under something she'd believed was stable. The ground had shifted. What stood on it now was different. She looked at her laptop screen. The framework document, half-built. The email to Delphine's attorney, unsent. The ordinary work of a Wednesday night that was already becoming a Thursday morning. She thought about Sienna, at home somewhere, probably asleep, her name on the dashboard documentation. She thought about Marcus, who had eaten a breakfast sandwich at 6 in the morning after working through the night and had said thank you when she'd told him to go home, and she'd understood from the way he said it that it wasn't just about being allowed to leave. She thought about Roy Callahan, uncrossing his arms and reaching for the legal pad. She thought about Sandra Pierce, writing down 3 payer codes that had been wrong for 2 years and waiting for someone to build a place worth writing them into. She thought about the documentation system, growing each day, section by section, becoming the thing that meant no one person had to carry it alone. She closed the laptop. She left it on the table. She turned off the kitchen light. She went to bed. For the first time in longer than she wanted to calculate, she did not lie awake running through anything. No lists, no contingencies, no scenarios mapped and remapped against each other in the dark. She lay down and she closed her eyes and the quiet held, and she was in it, and the work would be there in the morning, and she would do it in the morning. And tonight there was nothing left that required her to be awake for it. She blessed. Outside, Atlanta kept going. The downtown corridors and the highway interchanges and the parking garages and the glass-walled conference rooms empty and dark and waiting. The Aldercrest building with its lit lobby and its overnight staff and its monitoring dashboard running clean green across every metric. The routing system doing what it was built to do. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, in the formal record of the company, in the letterhead, and the org chart, and the executive directory, and the office door on the 14th floor, that now had a new name on it, was the permanent, documented, irrevocable fact of Marissa Holloway. Not her position, not her title. Her, what she knew, what she'd built, what she'd been willing to say out loud with her name on it when it mattered, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. Because hard and necessary had always, for her, pointed in the same direction. They had tried to replace her. They had replaced her position. The position was a chair in a room. What Marissa was had never fit in a chair. It had never fit in a cardboard box, either. It had just taken being handed one to make her remember that.